working class backgrounds who feel, like sort of just an anxiety about what this shift means towards a greener economy. And, when we had sort of the big shift when we were looking at sort of the tech sector and sort of the creative sectors, it excited people about the opportunities that were coming. And I just wonder both whether Phil and Shirley had any reflections on how we could start to sort of, excite people about sort of the job opportunities that may be created from shifting towards a sort of a greener economy.
Thanks very much for that question. I'm going to take Julia Needham-Watts as well, please.
Thank you. And thank you. It's great to be here to hear all the initiatives and that call for collaboration and cross-party working, which I support. My question is, it's about the practicality of implementing some of the things we want to do, in particular retrofit or fitting sustainability measures on old properties, Edwardian and Victorian properties, of which we have a lot, and no doubt other boroughs do as well. And whether there's room for a discussion about more clarity on when planning permission is required, what people are permitted to do without worrying about planning permission, and how we gauge the balance between what could be considered a private benefit of having renewable energy on your house versus the public, what might be seen as a negative impact on heritage assets and period properties in particular, and how much of a public benefit we can attach to having widespread PV cells all over our properties. That's quite a niche question, I realise, but it's one that's looming quite large, certainly in Richmond, and I'm curious to know across London, is there a way to tackle that with a bit more clarity? So that's my sort of observation and question.
Thank you, Julia. So a couple of questions there on how do we really excite communities to get on board with this, and given the polling results, I suspect we are in a good place to do that, but we just need to show communities, I think, what's in it for them as well. Why should they get involved and why should they be excited about it? And then the more niche question in terms of retrofitting the more difficult buildings, and I don't know if you will be able to answer that in detail, but I know that our Retrofit London is thinking about those sorts of questions. But anyway, over to you, Shirley first, and then Phil.
Sure. So on the questions about the move to the green economy, it's absolutely a point that the right point, because people don't really know what a green job is. And, my worry is that we always talk about it, the next phase is usually retrofitting. So, and that's not what I think a green economy is. I think for a start, the whole economy needs to be green. And we need to convey that across, to the people who are working in our economic development units, to business and so on, who probably have got it actually. But, when I think green jobs, we're talking from the gamut from the construction's modern methods of construction all the way through to the City of London, and people who work in sort of engineering, who work on legal contracts, consultancy, providing advice to people abroad, to NGOs who are working in a whole host of the sort of areas that we're working on, from energy through to fuel poverty, whatever. So I think just getting across to people what that actually means. And you're right, we need to inspire people to say, to understand what the opportunities are. But more than anything, people are worried about what that means. Are they going to lose their job? So, I mentioned some of the work that we're doing, and I know some of the sub-regional partnerships are, and the councils is, and we're sort of working together to make sure we're not duplicating. Where do we really need to sort of tackle that sort of just transition and reassure people and provide, for example, working with Jules Pipe and the adult education budget, we've got some a call out now to develop skills academies in, moving on from the construction academy, but in sort of tech and green skills, landscaping. There's a whole sort of set of issues around green infrastructure. We're working with Thames Water and some of the utility companies, who are really skilled in that. Those are the green jobs that we're talking about. So that is absolutely what we're trying to do now. And then I think working with trades unions, working with adult education and so on, we've really got to push that and excite people, as you say. And on the retrofitting for older homes. This is a question that we get asked all the time, permitted development rise, the inconsistency of approach across local authorities. So, I'd really welcome the work that Retrofit London are looking at, because if we can get some more consistent advice on that, that would then really help both the planners, I guess, and people and installers as well.
Thanks. So two really good questions, and I'll start with Meta K-band, and obviously it's a thing we talk about a lot as borough leader and cabinet member in Hackney, and I think it requires some really clear de-siloisation, not to be too jargon about it. What Shirley's talked about in terms of the Green New Deal recovery mission, I think, is the clear overarching target, doubling the size of the green economy, but also recognising that so many jobs and parts of our economy are going to have to be green themselves as we move through the next decade and beyond if we're going to hit net zero. So that skills piece is absolutely critical. And what we do in schools, I think about climate literacy, thinking about how do we, none of us have come into, or very few of us have come into our roles here with high degrees of climate literacy from our education. We're going to have to, I think, embed that, and there's some good campaigns about ensuring that both at GCSE and A level, but also into HE and FE, that there's sort of climate literacy and understanding. There are huge skills gaps here, so there's opportunities both for business and the public sector. We're going to have to grow our own expertise. We will need apprentices. We will need to deal with the challenge of an aging workforce, when often we're talking about, whether it's transport engineers, whether it's talking about the people that maintain our homes, and some of the expertise in order to deal with some of the regulatory requirements, things like the Environment Bill, when it comes to planning, biodiversity, nature recovery. So I think we need to flip it as an opportunity, and we need to be really excited about what the future holds, while also working with those parts of the economy that are going to find it more challenging. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done with the Zero Emissions Network in Hackney, working with Islington Hamlets in the city, but also the GLA and TfL, which is creating peer-to-peer networks amongst business that help with some of those decisions. If you've never bought an EV vehicle before, you've never thought about how some of your activities could take place on a cargo bike, or even ridden a cargo bike. It's a huge leap to suddenly say to people top down, you're going to have to change how your entire business model works. So I think there needs to be more work at the borough level, sub-regional level, and what we're talking about here at a London-wide level around those sorts of initiatives. And I know one of the key borough programmes is around that green economy and skills. I think Shirley was also right about the TUC and union involvement. We have that in the expert advisory group on the Green New Deal. And I think there is, without getting too party political, this is cross-party. Within the Labour movement, there are some concerns about what transition means for highly unionised, energy-intensive industries. And if we don't answer that question, we're going to see more obstacles in the way of the sort of transition we need to get to net zero. And we must make sure that the new economy still has high quality, well-paid, highly skilled jobs that some of the energy intensive parts of industry have. On retrofit, Julia, I think it's really, really important that we crack this. We saw with the Decent Homes programme some real challenges with street properties in social housing, and upgrading those for what were the original targets around warmth and energy security then. In the retrofit report that we've just published and will formally launch next week, I think one of the key items is how planning decisions and guidance should support low carbon retrofit. And there's a whole section around the interaction between retrofit and conservation. I'm not the technical expert on that, but I think it shows that we've identified it across London's local government with housing directors as a critical area. And I think there's also references to some of the reports and bodies of work that different industry bodies have done to answer these questions and to help planners create local guidance that can work in the spirit of conservation areas and conservation. I think it's 40% or even more of the homes that will be living in 100 years' time have already been built in London. So retrofit is absolutely essential. 17% of all the homes in London are in a conservation area. And it won't just be wealthier people in those homes, it'll be people in real fuel poverty. So we have to get this right. I think the report is the first stage of that. And maybe it's something that, if there's sufficient interest in, we need to sort of take as a sort of subgroup for the work coming out of Retrofit. So by the time we get to the summit at the start of next year, we've got some greater clarity on that.
Thanks very much for that. There's a couple of things in the chat which I'll now come to, and then I'll come to you, John, after that. Yeah. So the first question is whether there's a handy directory of all of the borough collaboration opportunities out there, including government and GLA funding. I think there probably isn't one specific site. It's always difficult to bring all of those things together, but it's certainly something that we as London councils are working on and looking to improve our website offer on that in particular. Would be great to hear Phil and Shirley's views on financing Borough's action plan. So I'll come to you first, Phil, in a minute, and then Shirley, but I'll take the next question as well from Ellen around the link between cycling and public health and how that addresses basically two things by just changing sort of travel behavior. Oh, they're coming in fast now. But anyway, should we take those two first about how do we finance Borough's climate action plans and how do we make the stronger link between active travel and the public health agenda? Phil, if I come to you first.
Thank you. I think to answer, I think it's a huge challenge, the finance around getting to net zero and the action plan, but we shouldn't be intimidated by it because I think it can lead to a degree of inertia. You know, we've got all these other challenges. We've got austerity, we've got fire safety if you're a landlord. What do we do? How do we do it? So what I think we've been really clear at London Council is coming up with solutions. So one is obviously the work around UK Cities Climate Commission. That is looking at how we have a clear aggregated sense of the need of local authorities and cities across the UK around getting to net zero, and then working with finance to be a bridge between those two things. And I think there's two worlds and two cultures here. If we're to crack it, we have to make sure that they're investable propositions, but also the balance of risk. And Julia mentioned it, you know, risk and reward within this are quite complicated. You have landlords, you have tenants, you have people that might underpin finance to unlock finance, where risk moves up and down between business and the public sector. And that's what the Commission is sort of looking at, and we'll be launching the results of that. I'll let Shirley talk about the finance facility and the infrastructure funding and the accelerators that the GLA have already put together, and I think we can really work with them to build upon. I think we have to be really clear to government, you know, the £100 billion need or even the £60 billion need in London isn't going to be met by private finance or borough finance alone. And I think we saw sort of the gap between some aspects of government ambition, which I think is really clear in some of the more recent funding announcements. And I think we have to work really hard to convince Treasury that this is a fundamentally necessary and fundable proposition. And that work is ongoing. And again, it's cross-party, it's cross-sector, and we work London councils with the LGA on that. And there's more to do. You know, we're still in the 4 billion territory with the announcement yesterday, and whether that's some of the money recycled that we already knew was in there in the kind of public sector decarbonisation, I don't know, because I haven't been able to go into that level of detail. I think we also need to look at our own asset management plans and start thinking about what transitioning them looks like. You know, we will be spending in Hackney alone about £60 million capital spend on our local housing stock each year. We're still at the foothills, I think, of what does a decarbonised version of that look like? You know, when would we make our own commitment about not installing another gas boiler? You know, 2035 for a borough leading like Hackney seems a long way away, but 2025 is going to be too soon given our skills. The final bit on the public health and active travel, I think we need to make sure this isn't just a discussion about one mode of transport, but this isn't just a discussion about promoting cycling for the able. there is a much broader equalities piece around air pollution, active travel, public health, some of our poorest communities that are impacted by some of the weakest infrastructure and the poorest air. And while we're promoting cycling and we need the infrastructure to support it, we're also promoting inclusive cycling, walking and the public transport. And then Mete's question, it is clear we need the EV infrastructure and the business infrastructure to allow those that are still using private motor car or deliveries to transition out of ICE to less polluting modes. But I think the public health dividend, the way that the public health and health system and NHS to come behind the work that Shirley's doing, I think shows the real appetite to look at these issues through a public health and health in all policies lens with things like health and wellbeing boards.
Thanks, Phil. Shirley?
Yeah, just very quickly. So have a look on our website. It's probably not instantly jumping out, but on the environment pages, there's a number of sort of programs that we've got open on our retrofit accelerators, providing free technical advice and sort of routes into the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund, which is a £500 million worth of funding or financing rather for energy efficiency projects, whether it's retrofit or electric vehicles and so on. But we're trying to build on that because that ME fund ends in about 23. So we're developing in London a financing facility. The roundtable I mentioned earlier was just testing with investors what sort of options, risk appetite and so on that they were interested in, and also signalling through Phil's work on the commission, what the opportunity is in London and beyond London. So really just signalling this is a big issue. And obviously we've got the big global investment dinners and summits that the government and the royal family are hosting today. The point is, there is a lot of investment needed. We can't do it alone, nor could the private sector. We have to work together on this, including with government, because they will need to provide some of that funding. In terms of what you might be able to do more immediately, well, I point to the offset funding, through the development, London plan developments, anything that can't be met on site has to provide some offset funding that sits in local authorities. I would urge you, to maximise the amount of drawdown of that money from developers as soon as you are able to and spend the money, because that is a source. And then absolutely agree with Phil, we have to turn all of our budgets and not just our asset management plans and so on to how will they not only support some of the other outcomes we want, whether it's health or social outcomes or environmental outcomes, but to what they can do at the same time to deliver on net zero as well. So it is about maximising as far as possible the co-benefits. And that's sort of an approach that we've taken. So talking about the active health agenda, for example, on the ultra low emission zone, the big difference we've done there is really talk about the health outcomes and enlist the public health organisations, NGOs, health trusts and so on, to really talk about the impacts that people are facing from our toxic air, and how solutions like the ultra low emission zone or active transportation will really help with that. So it's not just about reducing particulate matter or NO2, it's about how do we improve and help people live better, longer, healthier, longer lives. So I think, again, it's about those co-benefits that we just need to really emphasise. And I think that goes to how we persuade people that we are taking action, but also this action is also good for them and their families.
Thanks very much. Yes, the co-benefits, I think, very important, and linking back to the communities piece and how do we bring communities with us. Earlier point made by colleagues, I think very important in that respect as well. Okay, let me go to John and then Mary Claire, please. John, your question.
Hi, good morning to you, to everybody. I'm John Mitchinson. I'm the Energy and Sustainability Manager working for Homes for Haringey, and I'm responsible for overseeing deep retrofit program called Energy Sprung, which is partly funded from BEIS and also is part of the GLA's framework. One of the issues that I have, obviously, is to try and convince tenants to buy into the proposal. And so really, I've got two questions, because to me, buy-in and, should we say, statistics matters. And so one of the first, at the opening presentation, was all about statistics, about Londoners understanding what climate change means. So what, to me, what it's important to me is to know what the sample size was. I mean, how big, how many people were actually interviewed for the polling exercise to actually produce the statistics? You know, where was it done? When was it done in London? And who are we talking about when we talk about Londoners? Are we talking about people who actually live in London, or people who've come into London to work? So I think these are important questions, which I need, you know, to have an answer to when we come to talking about producing statistics to convince people the importance of the topic. The other question which I'll link to basically the work I'm doing, which is all about deep retrofit. I mean, the cost of actually doing a retrofit scheme per unit is around about £85,000 at the moment, which involves putting in solar PV systems on the roof. Now, the concern I have is a PV system does use an awful lot of energy to produce. 90% of PV systems are manufactured in China. There's an awful lot of embodied carbon in the making of a PV system. A PV system only lasts for about 25 years. The design life of a PV system is 25 years. What do we do once it reaches its final life? We don't actually have in place a recycling scheme to deal with redundant PV systems. So that's something we need to talk about. We need to think about, when we're talking about climate change and dealing with issues of climate change, we also need to think about recycling, how we're going to use the resources in a sort of sensible way. We don't want to, in effect, export, which is a criticism that Greta Thunberg throws at us, exporting our carbon emissions to another abroad, effectively. This is what we seem to be doing when it comes to, you know, using certain technologies which are manufactured abroad. And we need to think of ways to try and manufacture something that can that really does not depend on energy-intensive processes. And I suppose finally, the other thing is when it comes to deep retrofit schemes, and what I'm looking at is all about decarbonising the heat. So in other words, removing the gas boiler and installing air source heat pump. And of course, that requires electricity. And one of the issues that we have is that the DNO, which is the district network operator, needs to know the infrastructure it's maintaining. So therefore, it needs to know what the actual energy load is at any particular time, and invest to improve its infrastructure. So when reducing the amount of energy expended as a result of no longer using gas boilers, we're now increasing the amount of energy as a result of using air source heat pumps, for example, even though they may be sized appropriately to meet the overall thermal load of a building, because you're improving the thermal performance of the building. You still got to improve, you still got to have a sufficient generating capacity to meet that load, and therefore we need to look at ensuring that we have a sufficient investment in the transmission and distribution of electricity to meet the requirements of putting air source heat pumps and also electric charging vehicles. So basically, is that part of the thinking that the GLA is looking at when it comes to trying to encourage a decarbonising or a low carbon emission agenda for Pan-London approach?
Thanks, John. I'm going to take Mary Claire as well, and then I'll come back to you. You first, Shirley, and then Phil again. Mary Claire?
Sorry, I'm just trying to come in. Sorry. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, what my question was, I was just trying to put my video on so people can see me. Oh, here we go. Hang on. Oh, hi. Yeah, it's a bit off the wall, my question. You might not like it, but it's just regarding sort of TfLs. I sort of read somewhere that they're pushing forward on with electric scooters. I mean, I understand obviously that may help lower emissions, but I mean, they're really dangerous. My mum was nearly run over by one. My dog was nearly run over by one recently. People don't follow the rules. They whiz everywhere on them, on pavements, this, that, and the other. I mean, I represent Havering, obviously more of an elderly population. So, you know, it's more of an issue. I mean, it's great if you're young, fit and healthy, you can jump on a bike, you can jump on an e-scooter. But if you're not, and your preferred method of transport is to walk, which is really good for older people, you know, I don't know why they're pushing it. Why can't you just focus on normal bikes? We don't need electric bikes anyway. Why can't we just use normal bikes? That's for a start. Electric bikes are just lazy, aren't they? Because you can't be able to cycle for long distance. And electric scooters, I'm sorry, I just think they're a very dangerous invention. I just wondered what your view on it was, sort of Mayor and Deputy Mayor, about and TfL's view, sort of stance on this.
Thanks, Mary Claire. So a couple of questions here on the sort of the deep retrofit, but also on the polling questions. And John, I can just confirm, I think it's 1,006 people that we interviewed, and they were all people interviewed within London. And we're looking for a representative sample in terms of age, ethnicity, ability, disability, that sort of stuff. So it's a representative sample of the London population. But Shirley, over to you for some thoughts, and then Phil.
Yeah, there was a lot in John's question, but just to reassure John, you know, this is a massive challenge that, you know, we in London aren't alone in facing. Lots of other cities, lots of countries. It's about that transition, which requires a different way of thinking, but a strategic way of thinking. And, you know, Governor got their 10-point industrial strategy, the various zero carbon strategies that they've launched this week, you know, the heat and decarbonisation and so on. But from a London point of view, we've been doing a lot of thinking about this for many years, as have London councils, and we've been working together on many of these sort of issues. So if you're talking about, for example, the energy load on our network, you know, there's a consultation out with UKPN and the DNOs about, and Ofgem in fact, about the future infrastructure. And we have been talking to them really about recognising that needs to change, and that they need to be able to give the DNOs the ability to support the ambition that we have in London to support zero carbon infrastructure. We published on Friday a draft electric vehicle infrastructure strategy for 2030, updating the one that we have at the moment, so that we are keeping pace with not only the growth in electric vehicles in London that we need alongside the mode shift and move to public transport and active transport, but, you know, understanding, you know, how we might finance that, and that's out for consultation at the moment. And part of that is working, you know, part of that sort of stakeholder consultation, the group that was involved in that were UKPN, because we know that this is going to change the call on loads. There's work that we're doing and many others are doing on battery technology, so we can flex our electricity infrastructure so that it doesn't fall over. And just to reassure people, it's not going to fall over. And we do have more than enough chargers in London to keep pace with the existing electric vehicles we have, and the growth that we're seeing in the strategy is going to keep pace with that. So lots in there. You asked about, you know, are we thinking about recycling all the sort of electric vehicle infrastructure or solar and so on. We have a number of policies we're working with London councils through, for example, London, which is our statutory body on waste management. They've, you know, beyond just managing our waste, we and they are looking at how we promote the circular economy. So how are we looking at making sure that we are more resource efficient in the first place? so that we are not consuming and exporting our emissions to other countries. And, you know, obviously, we would like to see many more things produced within the country. That's part of government's industrial strategy, and part of the sort of investment work that we're doing. The Mayor is going to the event tonight, is about drumming up investment to support businesses in London. Now, those aren't necessarily going to be products, but there will also be services. You know, we're more of a sort of knowledge-based, service-based and SME-based economy in London. You know, so all of those things we are looking at in the London plan. We have an embodied carbon policy, you know, pioneering in the country and probably in the world, I think, about getting developers to think about reusing infrastructure and then how do they account for the whole life cycle carbon emissions. And just very quickly on e-scooters, I don't think TfL are pushing this. I think what government has asked us is to trial some of these things. And in trialing them, we then understand what the problems are around, you know, where best they're used and how safely, or if they're not safely, what can be done to make them more safe. I think what we're trying to do is make sure that whether it's electric bikes or electric scooters or electric vehicles, electric buses, that, you know, that we're trying to represent the needs of all Londoners. And, you know, not everybody is going to want an electric bike or an electric scooter, but, you know, for those who do, we need to make sure that they are done safely and work with the rest of the transport system. But more than anything, you know, that they recognise and respect other people's wishes, needs, and desires.
Thank you.
I'll start with Marie's e-scooter question. So I have a healthy skepticism about EV scooters. I think that's sort of known, but I also co-lead the London Council's contribution to the pilot. And what has sort of convinced me about the power of the pilot is that it is a regulated pilot. So many of the things that you're talking about behaviour, about it being unregulated, that the pilot boroughs are able to offer a legal solution. And I suppose if you're not on an e-scooter that is provided by Dot, Lime or Tia in the 11 boroughs that are taking part in the pilot, you are using that EV scooter in the public realm illegally. So anything that you're describing that is happening in Havering isn't happening from a TfL-led pilot, because they aren't available in Havering. They're not available in Hackney yet either. And what the advantage of the pilot and the policies that have been put in place is that they're insured, you have to have a driving license, they're geo-fenced, there are speed limits. If you were to take the pilot to Havering, you'd be able to decide which parts of the borough you could use them in, which parts not. If you've got pedestrianised town centre, it can be limited to 5 miles an hour. You can geo-fence pavements, canal towpaths, park paths, all of that sort of thing. So I think it's really important we think about, you know, the new technology is out of the box firmly. There are no restrictions on sales. I think if we're to get this right, we need a regulated environment that keeps the most vulnerable Londoners safe. And we've got, through the pilot, obviously, we're looking at the impact, usage, accident data, all of those things. And our partners are really keen to make sure that it is safe. And I think that insight is also going into, if it was a regulated, and you were able to own a private scooter, you know, should they have noise, speed limiters, all of that kind of thing embedded in them. I think there is an equalities issue on all types of EV kind of personal vehicle, whether it's the EV bike or the scooter. When I talk to disabled and older adults, they do favour the EV version of the bike if they can afford it, and it actually keeps people cycling longer.
Right.
And parts of the capital obviously are hilly. You know, I wouldn't want to take Archway on a pedal bike in a suit, to be honest. So I think we're not favouring one over the other. It's a mixed mode, and hopefully it's being kind of intelligently done. And actually, having taken part in the trial and taken out to East Ham Bus Garage, you know, using one for the first time with a helmet, you start to understand what a safer version of that could look like. But I'm not a salesperson for it. I just think it's part of our solutions. On John's very detailed point, I think we are making sure that the sector-led response in London has the expertise of housing directors in it. So Retrofit has been endorsed by the directors of housing, and the detailed report that we've just published, I hope, would John would see some of his concerns reflected in it. And I hope that if he doesn't feel completely involved in it, that we can involve John in that, in taking it to the next steps, because it must be practical and it must be holistic. One of the things that have come out of the UK CCIC work is, and I think it's in the chat about the conversation about conservation areas, you can't just look at one component and one home, especially in a block of flats or a terrace. You have to have a solution that deals with a whole envelope and deals with a whole, otherwise you'll have heat loss into neighbouring property. You'll miss the, heat pumps do not work in uninsulated retrofitted properties. Shirley and I were talking about that earlier. They will underperform, and then the carbon benefit of using a heat pump and the benefit to a warm home will be lost if you don't have the insulation in the retrofit. So we do absolutely have to get it right. And I take your point about long-term full life cycle carbon and recycling. I think this is what I'll just finish on, because we're probably running out of time. Unless we get the right finance and regulatory environment, we won't see the local supply chain. Coming back to the start, the Mete question, we need to have the certainty that allows SMEs, local manufacturers to have the confidence to invest around these technologies and help deliver it. What we have at the moment is frankly just two short-term pieces of funding and uncertainty. So you're not seeing supply chains mobilising enough around this agenda, and we need to work together to ensure that happens. And then there'll be fewer imports of some of this technology and even technical expertise. I think a lesson of sort of SET and decent homes and eco, and the work about low carbon development like CLT construction, is the supply chain is still very European, which is great on one level. We can learn from our European partners, but post Brexit, with the wish to grow our own green economy, we need to see more of that industry in the UK as well, and in London if possible.
Thanks very much for all of that and for all of those questions. I'm going to draw this to a close now. And I'm aware that there are a couple of questions we didn't get to in the chat, and we will take them away and answer them offline. So thanks very much for that. And there's a point raised in particular to sort of broaden the climate change agenda to a number of different policy areas. And I think that's very right. And that's something we talked about at the breakfast event as well, to make sure that more people are taking ownership of the agenda and it's not just seen as an environment issue. So, but we'll take those away and answer them afterwards. So can I just say thanks very much to Phil and Shirley for fielding all those questions and for your opening remarks. And sorry for keeping you slightly longer, Shirley, than the 11 o'clock as promised. So thank you for that. And we're now going into our shared learning breakout groups. So thank you, Zach, for listing all of the breakout groups there. So what will happen now is you will get the option of joining a breakout group in just a minute. And these will last for about an hour. Now we're running slightly late, so if I can have you all back by 12:05, that eats slightly into our lunch break, but I think that's probably okay. So we've had 5 minutes longer for the Q&A, and we'll have chip off 5 minutes on the lunch hour. So these are our learning sessions, and thanks again for all of the Borough colleagues who volunteered for these. So we've got Meet the Cities, championing sustainability in supply chains, how we're helping children and young people and schools to access climate education initiatives, workshop on the green economy, journey of Islington along the decentralized energy path, engaging residents in climate adaptation. We've talked about the community angle earlier, eco show home, Waltham Forest for climate action, and driving EV take up in Westminster. So you should be able to get, yes, you can now in your menu at the bottom, you get a join a breakout room and you get the choice of those 7. So if you now join one, everybody who's left behind who's not joining one will automatically be put into one, but you you don't get to choose if you don't do that. So if I can leave you to go into your breakout rooms now. Yes, so now really the sort of next hour and a half to 2 hours are really to explore our 7 themes a little bit more. So you'll be aware of our joint statement that we had back in 2019, and out of that we started to develop the 7 programs, and now we've got lead boroughs for all those 7 programs. So each of the lead boroughs will take us through them in turn. I think going to be really interesting and quite interactive session. So all of them will last about 20 minutes and give you all a good idea of what they're up to and give you the opportunity to find out how you can get involved in these 7 programs and how you can help shape them for the future for all of London. So we are going in the following order. So we're having Retrofit London first, which will be led by Joanne Drew, Dominic Millen and James McHugh. Then we're going to Renewable Power, led by Keith Townsend. Then we go to Low Carbon Transport, led by Matthew Hill and Sarah Rye. Then to Low Carbon Development, led by Aled Richards and Natalie Broughton. And then we'll have a slight comfort break before we continue with our One World Living program, led by Alex Dewsnap and Matthew Adams, the Green Economy, led by Victoria Lawson, and Resilient and Green, led by Tom Sharland. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome Joanne Drew, Dominic Millen and James McHugh to kick us off on Retrofit London, please.
Okay, thanks so much, Katharina. Just a few words of introduction about our London Retrofit Action Plan that you're going to hear about now. It essentially brings forward a new housing standard, which we're really excited about. And whilst the driver for this is obviously about reducing carbon emissions, like all of our programmes, they have multiple benefits, which I just wanted to pick out. And those benefits are obviously for Londoners in particular. So more efficient use of energy so that warmth is more affordable, improved insulation and triple glazed windows so that it helps to minimise the conditions that can create damp and mould in homes. These are the sorts of things that our retrofit programme will address and make the lives of Londoners better on a day-to-day basis. So whilst our programme might grab the headlines for the amount of financial investment that's needed, it's really about these benefits that are at the fore. It's also about the creation of these new jobs and, importantly, the way we think about adapting our homes to meet the future needs of the country, of the world. So really set against those objectives, the cost of our programme is absolutely where it needs to be. So in terms of just wanted to say a big thank you to London Councils. We are really enjoying leading this programme and have had great support both from yourselves and from boroughs and a whole range of broader stakeholders. So I'm really pleased that Dominic and James are able to present an overview of our programme.
Afternoon, everyone. So hopefully you can see and hear me. Thank you, Katharina.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, we're just going to give a quick run through of the Retrofit London programme. So it's James McHugh, Head of Housing Strategy at Waltham Forest, and myself, Dominic Millen, Head of Climate Action and Sustainability at Enfield. If we can have the first slide. So retrofit is a priority for the capital. We're focusing today on housing retrofit, although the wider programme does include commercial. So homes account for around 1/3 of London's emissions. And as Joanne mentioned, the quality of housing impacts on both health and the wealth of our residents. Action on retrofit is supported at all levels of government. So running down from, I think it was very recent announcements from national government, Clearly, the GLA and the Mayor have a target for retrofit to be completed, so we have net zero by 2030. But also it's people on the street, and this is from last year's London Council's climate attitude survey, and it goes to show that people are more than willing to consider insulating their homes, and actually surprisingly quite a high number would consider replacing their existing gas boiler and moving away from gas usage. So we can have the next slide. In terms of the programme objective, as I mentioned, it's to retrofit all domestic and non-domestic buildings, and that's to an average level of EPC-B or equivalent by 2030. The reason we've put or equivalent is because for the housing element of this work, we recognise that EPC is not necessarily the best way to achieve carbon savings. And so we've come up with some alternative metrics while also retaining the EPC average. So to do this will require fabric improvements, heat decarbonisation, and obviously renewable energy. In terms of the challenges, the overarching ones we've identified are demand and take-up, delivery and supply, technical and finance. And I won't go into detail of those because I think most people will understand what they mean. If we can have the next slide, please. So in terms of the programme overview, I'm not sure having a mountain to climb is something that I relish, but this is really saying that where we're trying to get to is that all of London's homes have been retrofitted. And to get there, the first thing that we've done is undertaken data analysis and developed some principles. And that was based on work by Parity Projects. We've now developed an action plan, which was recently launched. And that was a consortium of consultants led by Etude, and it involved a number of stakeholders. And together, those pieces of work were funded by a range of organisations, so London Housing Directors, London Environment Directors, the GLA, and with extensive support from London councils. So in terms of the next stage of the journey, we need to take the action plan, which is quite an extensive document, and put into place an implementation plan that looks at both how we're going to take the actions and take them forward into delivery over the next 2 to 3 years, but also some of those practical elements such as governance and engagement. And then what this is also showing is that we recognise that this isn't a straight line and that there will be different paths to get to the same overall target, and that we need to be able to support the London local authorities and other stakeholders to do this. We can have the next slide. In terms of the scale of the challenge, this really is a bit of a mountain to climb. So the data analysis looked at 2 pathways. It looked at the EPC average interim target, but it also considered net zero as a final target. And as Joanne mentioned, what we came up with is a total investment package, which was 2 very big numbers. So around 49 billion for EPCB average by 2030, and almost double, so 98 billion for net zero by 2030. You'll see that there's an average investment per home, and it's the same pattern. So it's about 13,000 for EPCB, double for net zero. What this does hide is that there's quite a lot of variance. So there's a number of properties that are in the low thousands, but then there's actually some in the hundreds of thousands. But broadly, they do cluster in similar ranges. So kind of from about 7,500 up to about 20,000. And then just the last thing there is the final average carbon in tonnes per CO2. And this is the average, so the final figure is 1.59 tonnes under EPCB and then 0.48 under net zero. That's actually effectively zero, but it has to factor in grid decarbonisation. And you'll see that the average reduction is about 1.69 tonnes for EPCB and almost double for net zero. So if we can have the next slide, please. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is what does this mean in terms of the measures that are required? Excuse me. And this comes about because there's a few figures now being bandied about as to how much investment is required for retrofit. So we wanted to look at what we think it means in terms of the specific areas. So you'll see that for fabric, it's about £24 billion, and that gets you kind of 7.3 million measures, which is pretty much something in every house in London. And then heating and hot water, again, 16.5 billion, and then nearly 6 million interventions. And then net zero, interestingly, what you'll see is because of the way the model worked, is there's not as much around fabric, because it's really starting to focus a lot more on heat decarbonisation. And I think this just gives you an idea of what it means in terms of interventions and what we need to deliver in properties across London. So if we can go to the next slide. So the other big challenge is who's going to deliver all of these measures. So the work by Parity actually looked at skills and employment requirements as well. And we see this as both a significant challenge, but also it's a massive opportunity. So the graph on the right is the interim EPCB average target. And that's saying that if you have a steady ramp up, by 2030, you've got 110,000 full-time equivalent trade jobs, and the current base is about 4,000. So that's a huge increase. And then the table below is looking at net zero. That's forecasting about 196,000 full-time equivalent trades jobs at peak. But the interesting thing is that they're not all specialists. So you've got general builders, you've got people installing insulation, plasterers and renderers, window fitters, carpenters, electricians. They're all general skills, they're all transferable skills. So actually the bulk of the people we need to skill up are going to be able to work on future projects. So potentially that's huge. It means you've got people who have jobs for life, and it also means we deal with a lot of the ongoing gaps. General builders is a classic example. If we can have the next slide. So I'll pass over to James.
Thanks, Dominic. So we saw some general consensus across boroughs around a series of 8 principles. And these are things such as the need for boroughs themselves to retrofit their own stock and to facilitate retrofit across the whole of the housing stock, to help create a stable and sustainable market in retrofit, that planning decisions and guidance should support this agenda, that we'll need to move away from gas heating rapidly, and the contention there is that hydrogen is unlikely to be the answer, that we need more than just EPC ratings, and they're insufficient in themselves, that energy costs shouldn't increase as a result of retrofit, that asset management and maintenance decisions should be consistent with this plan, and that boroughs will work collectively to develop the skills, procurement models, and to engage with residents. The next slide, please. Okay, so the action plan is based on 4 key themes. So first of all, retrofit measures and plans. So I guess that's the kind of mechanics of the installation side of it. So like Dominic was referring to earlier, all of the things around kind of fabric-based measures, ventilation, electrification, and so forth. And those are the things that we really need in place across London, across various different types of houses to actually achieve those targets. The second part of it is about delivery model skills and the supply chain, which I guess is the kind of the how to do it. So that's things around kind of maintenance programs, about the kind of large scale procurement of materials and labour required, using planning as a key enabler of this activity, the development of skills, and then finally also about kind of how we report and monitor on progress on this whole area. The third of the themes of the action plan is around cost, funding and finance. So things here about establishing the actual cost and the business case for retrofit, to maximise capital for our own stock, to set up a finance task force to look at things like equity and the kind of private finance market, and then similar to that, looking at private investment in private properties. The final theme of the action plan is around engagement, take-up, and I think it's marketing as well. And that is around trying to engage across the social housing sector. So many of us have a variety of housing associations operating in our local authorities. So it's working with them and the residents to roll out retrofit. Also looking to engage with the private sector, so both private landlords and owner occupiers. Lobbying government for a more positive funding and legislative climate around retrofit. And then just very finally is trying to ensure that we're able to implement this action plan together as boroughs. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So another thing that we looked at was kind of how retrofit is affected by different archetypes and areas. And what we looked into was how delivery could be scaled up by looking at particular common sets of measures which would apply to certain building types and areas. So with our colleagues at Parity, we kind of broke up London's housing stock into various different archetypes. And I think the top three of the archetypes are the ones on screen. So that there's solid brick mansion blocks and converted street properties account for close to 30% of the total properties in London. And they can be quite difficult in that they can have a mixture of kind of leasehold arrangements in them. So they can be as challenging, if not more challenging, than some of the kind of individual street properties. We also have homogeneous housing estates, which account for a further 22%, and then solid brick terraces at about 10%. So what we're kind of saying here is kind of the thing to focus is about what we can learn about commonalities of retrofitting particular types of properties, and that often this is more of a driver in terms of action than it might be around things like tenure, for example, in terms of understanding the requirements. Could I have the next slide, please? So as Dominic said, this is quite a big area, and we've kind of touched on this throughout the day so far. So where exactly do we start? And I think we start by trying to deliver some of those kind of early activities or quick wins. So an example of that is to run a London-wide information campaign on retrofit, and that this will aim to raise awareness of the opportunities, and particularly at key intervention points, to shed light on the unknown, to inform people and demystify retrofit, and to amplify resident voices to communicate positive messages from individuals. So I think starting with some of those kind of easier activities and trying to set the context and get a bit of debate and discussion going first, really. Could I have the next slide, please? So why is this action plan particularly important? I think it breaks down into the fact it represents a robust starting point. So we've developed this with consultation and collaboration from experts and with key stakeholders, and we've been doing that across the past 12 months with a lot of boroughs and individuals on this call. It also represents a massive first step, because I think for the first time it sets out a kind of a comprehensive approach at the London level, backed by a really thorough analysis of the entire housing stock across London. And then finally, it identifies a real key role for us as local authorities across London, ensuring the successful delivery of retrofit. And ensuring that we've got other stakeholders engaged and kind of willing to take up the challenge with us. So that's why we feel this is really important, and we feel this is really quite pioneering in terms of that kind of regional approach. Could I have the next slide, please? So it also helps to inform decisions. So, for example, there's analysis of the indicative cost of measures versus potential carbon savings. And I think what we can clearly say is we can expect some of these costs to maybe shift and vary across the next decade or so. in response to kind of changing markets and economies of scale. There's obviously been quite a lot of talk about heat pumps today in light of the recent political announcements, and you can see there that's a real kind of critical component here, in that kind of it's one of the most single costly measures, but in terms of the carbon savings, it's the one which delivers the greatest volume in terms of those carbon emissions. So I think it's understanding the kind of different interventions that are possible, and the kind of economics of it, and what the payoff is, and not just the payoff in terms of necessarily kind of those bill savings, but the wider payoffs in terms of carbon emissions, public health, and so forth, really. So now we've got the action plan, what do we do next with it? So the first thing that needs to be done is we've got this kind of action plan which has got all the headlines and the kind of direction of travel. Off the back of it, we're going to be preparing an implementation plan which covers the wider programme delivery elements, so things like governance, marketing, engagement, and so forth. So we're kind of breaking that down into smaller, kind of shorter term deliverables. We're also looking to set up a practitioners group to share knowledge and get into the real detail of things. So whether that be matters of kind of planning policy and considerations about permitted development, or it be things about the actual kind of the mechanics of particular measures themselves and the installation of them. So that's something that we see as critical. We're also looking to develop a delivery approach that can support the programme of this scale and of scale in terms of volume and the timings of it as well, because it's going to be a decade-long programme. And to support that, we're really looking to try and secure resources for programme management. So we're trying to ensure this is on a kind of solid, stable footing to take it forwards. Okay, then the next slide, please. So these are just some of our kind of headline key asks. So I think, first of all, we'd like to see greater recognition from central government that Retrofit London is a nationally important infrastructure project in terms of the scale of the work needed and some of the benefits from it, and I guess some of the economic benefits as well as just the social ones. We're also hoping to have a bit more consistency and flexibility in terms of central government funding for social housing retrofit to help kickstart this wider activity. So I think what we've certainly seen over the past couple of years is often quite discrete short-term funding pots being released by BEIS and Treasury, and that doesn't really necessarily allow landlords, property owners, the supply chain and the wider market to have that kind of consistency to really plan their activities. Another of the key asks is around collaboration and coordination, including across the 33 London local authorities. So this is something we'll need to step forward and move into together. So the more that we can share on this, the better, really, in terms of advancing the kind of activities. And then just finally, we're asking for boroughs attending today to work with us to start delivering the action plan. So there are things that you each can do yourselves when you go back to your jobs this week. So one is to develop a retrofit action plan for your own stock. And you can use that to better understand the issues and to further some of your conversations with the wider community about retrofitting. And then the second thing is to where possible, try to prioritise whole house retrofit. And I know that can be quite difficult in terms of the financial kind of business case for things and making sure there's that capital funding available. But really, that's what we need, and that's what's going to have the greatest kind of bang for your buck, is trying to go in and do that whole house retrofit rather than having to come back to properties in a piecemeal way and deliver different measures over a succession of different time periods. So those are the key asks. I mean, as we've said, it's a very large programme, but it's a very kind of exciting programme in terms of the scale of it and the potential opportunities and some of those wider benefits, whether they be kind of job creation benefits, skills, training, or the wider kind of public health benefits as well, and particularly for vulnerable groups in terms of trying to ensure the kind of quality of housing is much better than it perhaps currently is. So those are the key asks for the programme. I think it's just on to the final slide and questions now, I think. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure how long we've got left, but we're quite happy to take questions. I think there's a few that have come into the chat that we can have a look at as well.
Yes, you've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, James. So there was one in the chat, as you say, and then I can see Victoria has got her hand up. So Victoria, do you want to ask a question?
So I think really just on kind of James' final point about obviously developing a retrofit plan and that whole house retrofit approach. So we're currently doing quite a bit of work in terms of our social housing style, that retrofit and developing that and trying to get much more of the front foot than we have been historically. And we are trying to look at doing that whole house because, you know, we do not want to be going back 5 years down the line to find out measures we're then doing is negatively impacting what we've already done. But I suppose, you know, the challenge we've got is when we're looking at the government funding, whether that's social housing decarbonisation fund or other, that's not supporting that whole house approach. So is there any kind of lobbying work that this group is looking at as well around how we get some of that government funding a little bit more supportive of what we're trying to achieve with this?
Thanks, Victoria. James, should we take Keith as well? Keith, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Katharina. When we were doing the demonstration discussions before lunch, we saw the work that Waltham Forest have done on doing a comprehensive retrofit on a particular Victorian property. And given the way you've broken down the project and looked at property types, including sort of traditional terrace houses, do you think there is an opportunity for the Retrofit London programme to do some additional collective work across London, given many London boroughs are grappling with those older style Victorian and Edwardian properties, challenges with planning and so on, and doing something collectively as a cluster or a group of boroughs to try and get a range of whole property retrofit programs away?
Thanks, Keith. James or Dominic? James, I can't hear you anymore.
So yeah, I'll try and address those two questions, and I'll get Dominic to chip in as well. I think in terms of Keith's question about kind of whole house retrofit in particular archetypes, I think there's various things that we're looking at there. So one is simply about information sharing. So the more data we're able to collect and share with each other about particular projects we've got, the better our understanding is about how we approach these different issues. I think another couple of areas that we can collaborate on are firstly planning. So I think we've all got to greater or lesser extents issues and challenges in terms of the preservation of particular kind of aesthetic features of properties and conservation areas and so forth. And I think sometimes from a very kind of public perspective that the planning guidance is often quite unclear. And some of it is about looking at what resources we can develop to inform some of our own planning policies and guidance, and to make that information much clearer to households who might be interested in this whole agenda. And I know Camden, I think, have got some particularly good resources that were shared with us last week on it. I think that the final thing in terms of collaboration is something that we're looking at in terms of procurement. So I think there is possibly quite a lot of opportunities in terms of kind of how boroughs can collectively procure for materials, whether that be kind of at a panel level or breaking down into particular sub-regions, whether that be kind of east, north, south or so forth, really. And then just in terms of Victoria from Sutton's question, we have been via London Council's feeding in some messages to government in the design of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund about the kind of the future direction of that. And I think it obviously is a challenge for government and Treasury, because what you're trying to ensure is that public investment is spread as equitably as possible and makes the greatest impacts. But I think sometimes the challenge in that is, in terms of a long-term programme, it doesn't have those benefits of allowing for that whole house retrofit. So I think there's definitely things that we can do about trying to encourage government to be perhaps more generous in funding this agenda in recognition of the benefits. But I think as well, individually as boroughs, we've got to be quite creative in this and look at kind of different pots of funding and how we can line it up. And that can be quite difficult, but you know, if you're able to supplement things like Green Homes Grant with a bit of eco funding, maybe a bit of carbon offset funding, bit of householder contribution, I guess that's how you can start to piece up that funding for that whole house retrofit. But I mean, it certainly takes a lot of creativity and ingenuity and effort to be able to get to that position. Dominic, do you want to add anything?
Just in terms of, yeah, I think whole house retrofit, we totally agree that it should be what we're aiming for, particularly things around avoiding disrupting your residents unnecessarily. I would just say that we have to work with what we've got at the moment. So as James indicated, trying to pull together different funding streams and try to do as much whole house as possible, but also bear in mind that we should do what we can whilst the money's on the table. And one of the things that we want to look at is building passports so that that value is locked in. So you get the intervention, then you get the next intervention, and actually they're all there and people understand. And I think there was a question about what's the value for leaseholders. I suppose the short answer is, well, you've got reduced, hopefully, cost in terms of running your property, but also it's about locking that value in. And I think that's one of the key things, this funding conundrum, is actually you attribute a value to, say, putting in a new kitchen, but you don't decarbonising the heat source. So I think that's a real area of interest. And just saying, linked to that is the idea for landlords, for example, that you can have a warm rent so that you get a cut of the benefit. And I think as local authorities, that's saying that we need to understand as well, because a lot of this is coming out of our HRA, so it's going to be our own funding. So what is the benefit? Is there some way that we can pay back and actually recycle that money so we have an ongoing long-term programme? And conservation areas, we did do a presentation last year to, I think it was English Heritage, and there was lots of enthusiasm. Then one of my colleagues afterwards said, God, don't go near trying to coordinate around conservation areas. We've tried for years, we can't even agree whether double glazing is allowed or not. So I think that that is an area of challenge, but one that we have to do because a significant number of those properties that are most in need of retrofit are within conservation areas.
Katharina, can I just add about the point on lobbying, just to let everyone know that we have met along with other regional players, Lord Callan, who is the Minister for this area, and made kind of representations around the current structure of the funding programme, sort of requesting long-term strategic investment proposals. Also, we have a steering group for the programme which has got BES and DLUC officials, and with our working group of practitioners surfacing the issues that are arising on the ground, as well as our overall programme leadership, we think we'll have a rich body of evidence to help us continue to lobby for the right funding structures for the programme. So just wanted to let everyone know that, but obviously any views you've got on alternatives, let us know.
Thanks, Joanne, and that's a good closing remarks and a good call for action in the earlier slides there. So thank you very much to Retrofit London, and over to you now, Keith.
Thanks, Katharina. I'll just wait for the slides to appear. Thank you very much, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Keith Townsend, Corporate Director for Environment at Islington, and I'm just going to gallop you through progress towards the Renewable Power for London programme. So if we can move to the next slide, please. As one of the 7 programmes, we have an ambition that was set for us and discussed through with tech as well, around securing 100% renewable power for London's public sector now and in the future. As we formed the group of boroughs, and I'll come on to this in a minute to discuss what was fully in scope and to write our scoping documents, we actually quite quickly realised that there were 3 components of this programme. And so we've created the vision, the objectives, and indeed the work streams that flow naturally under these 3 headings. And I'll just explain a little bit what they are. Obviously, there's a component, an opportunity that we think we've identified around our purchasing power as a sector, and indeed across the public sector as a whole. And would that give us an opportunity to buy 100% renewable power? And we certainly think that procurement and that procurement activity has an opportunity. So again, linking in with the asks, one of the issues for those of us that are involved on the more environment side is to engage our procurement experts in this area, and they may well be within environment departments or within finance departments or wherever they sit. So there is an internal engagement piece that I think is required by local authorities as well. The second component, I'll miss out for a moment because I'll leap to the third component. We felt it was really important in our vision that there are actually many examples of innovative energy generation and storage projects across the capital being led by local authorities. And actually that should be a component of this programme because there are so many of these happening. And does that give us an opportunity to collaborate even further or to accelerate that even more? And that links in with the work that many of us would have been involved with at supporting the UK Cities Climate Change Investment Commission work, which has looked to cost net zero carbon as a whole across the capital. So that's the second component, which is around energy generation. And the third component is around actually many boroughs are providing advice and support and help to residents to reduce their consumption and save money. A number of boroughs in the past have been involved in white label energy companies, obviously with the slightly interesting situation in the energy market at the moment, particularly with gas supplies and gas providers, energy providers going bust. That's actually an interesting one for us to consider going forward. But also around touching on the fuel poverty issue and the opportunities this provides to really try and tackle that inequality agenda that we're all aware of. So those are the three components of the programme. So next slide just really gives an indication of the scale and the pace of which we've been trying to operate as a relatively new programme. And just a big thank you to all of our participating boroughs. We could only fit the logos on the steering group that we've established because there's so many boroughs that are part of the programme in terms of the working group. As you can see, 19 boroughs represented plus other organisations. It just shows the scale of the engagement, which I'm enormously grateful for, that we've had both technical leads and senior officer leads across organisations. We've been engaging with Laser, working obviously with London councils and Transport for London and the GLA and LEDNet and so on and so forth. So we do feel as if we are already engaging as we're working towards getting towards our high level action plan by the end of the year. What we have therefore done is broken the programme a little bit into the 3 work stream leads. This is very, very current. We've asked colleagues to take a lead on this particular work stream. So Laser, which you know is the buying consortium that many of you will use, are leading alongside others. That's not sole leading, with all of the technical officers that go with it as well on the procurement of renewable energy. Energy advice is being led by colleagues at Sutton, which is fantastic, and I've slightly presumptuously put the GLA in the I refer to it as procurement of renewable energy. That's actually decentralised energy projects, although we haven't actually got the GLA colleagues to agree to that yet, but we are working hard to persuade them to lead that bit of the work stream. So that's the mechanics of the programme. If we move to the next slide. Timeline and action plan, very similar. So we've only been formed really since June, but since that time, as I said, we have galvanised the boroughs and other organisations. We're having a challenge initial action planning session in November, early December. We do think we will get to a draft high level action plan this side of Christmas, although that is very, very challenging. But we do think there is an opportunity, and I'll explain what our emerging thinking is in that space. Moving on to the next slide. Just to give you a bit of a scale and a bit of sort of statistical context, this is where the emissions come from in terms of going back to Bayes data at 2019. So interestingly, us as public sector, and this is broader than just local government, of course, it's just 6%. Then when we're looking at domestic, we're talking at 37%, but then we're looking at commercial emissions and so on. You know, that is the biggest proportion by a long shot. So that's probably that's quite a helpful contextual slide in reminding us about the size of the prize. If we move to the next slide, please. So just to give you some interesting comparisons, what we've used is some of the BEIS data going back to 2019 that gives an indication about how much energy that the public sector procures in London. You can see the figures, 320 million is an estimate, and this is illustrative rather than precise, on electricity, and 123 million on gas, although I suspect both of those figures will be rising sharply in the short term because of the current circumstances. So what does that mean in terms of interventions that we could make in order to manage that? So if we move to the next slide. So if you look at public sector energy, if we were going to generate that ourselves, just to give you a bit of an idea of what that might look like, the top right-hand picture is the Queen Elizabeth II reservoir in Surrey with solar panels. That's a scheme that was introduced a few years ago. And we need to effectively deliver on 400 of those schemes to equate to that equivalent energy need that we talked about in the sector. And the other picture is the East London biogas anaerobic digester, which feeds homes in Dagenham. We'd need 200 of those plants to match that equivalent energy that we purchase as the public sector, just as a comparison. You move to the next slide. If you look at the domestic energy consumption and expenditure, again, 1.7 billion in terms of domestic electricity, 1.5 billion in terms of domestic gas. So just some interesting, I hope, comparisons about what does that mean in terms of if we were to try and generate that through this program. It would look like the next slide, which we've just picked. We've picked the offshore wind farm in the Thames estuary, which was one of the biggest up until 2018. We'd need 4 additional of those. And I picked a small example from, a small but important example from Enfield in terms of a district heating project supplying approximately 400 flats. We'd need 35,000 of those projects in order to match that consumption we talked about on the previous slide. And then finally, I just want to talk about energy sources. This is quite an interesting piece of fact, if you like, that we're thinking about. Of course, much of our energy is sourced outside the Greater London Authority boundary, which is interesting around how we secure added value for London, going back to some of the earlier conversations we had around jobs and skills and what have you. But it's an interesting contextual point. So go to the next slide. So if we were looking around using decentralized energy, so looking at gas sourced outside of the GLA boundary, that's the sort of value and the scale in terms of gigawatt hours that we are procuring outside. So therefore, what would that look like if we were not sourcing that from outside the GLA boundary? And that takes us to the last slide. Which is that picture on the right is Bun Hill 2. That's in Islington. That's a recent project we completed in Islington in the south of the borough, which is a Bun Hill 2 decentralised heat network, which in essence draws on heat from the London Underground, which is waste heat. And in order to match the consumption on the previous slide, we'd need 4,000 of those plants, which would certainly be a challenge to deliver. Given it was a challenge to deliver just one. Now, obviously, this is just illustrative and sort of a bit of fun, but it gives you an indication around the scale, but also the scale of opportunity. Next slide, please. So in terms of our ask of colleagues, it's to continue to be engaged as much as possible. Obviously, releasing as much capacity to help make these programs work is really, really important. And the support for your officers and your technical officers to be involved with the programme and participate in it on a borough perspective, but also to shape the London-wide perspective. And your feedback is integral to that programme. So that is that ask, that continuation of release of time, capacity and expertise to the programme. Next slide. Just to give you a flavour of the emerging proposition, so this is very, very early work following a workshop that was held in the summer around, well, what's coming out on the 3 work streams. In terms of accessible purchasing of energy, accessing energy rather, we think there is probably an emerging appetite and opportunity for a collaborative procurement for a power purchase agreement potentially. So we think there's some really interesting work in this space. And there's also a quite strong desire around renewable energy guarantees as a subsidiary of that part of the programme. But that collaborative procurement seems like an opportunity. In terms of energy advice, again, is there an opportunity or an appetite for around pan-London one-stop energy advice shop, if you like, for residents to try and tackle local measures, but also around tackling fuel poverty and the inequality points I mentioned. And then finally, in the decentralised energy, there does appear to be an emerging appetite for some sub-regional work around joining up our boroughs' decentralised energy thinking and seeing if there are opportunities sub-regionally. So in North London, there's been some initial debates across environment directors around connecting all of our borough projects in the North London sub-region potentially into a North London heat network. Is early thinking. And finally, last slide. And so in which case, the questions for yourselves are there any immediate thoughts for the programme, or indeed questions you have of all my colleagues from Islington who are with me today. Particular thanks to Ash Patel, who has been stoically coordinating the working group and helping me with the steering group. Thanks very much, colleagues.
Thanks very much. I think we do have time for 1 or 2 questions. John, I think the questions in the chat have been answered. So John, over to you.
Yes, thank you. The question I have is this. Do you feel confident that you will be able to achieve 100% renewables by 2030, given the extent of the issues that are facing us on this matter? Because you gave us, the equivalence of what is required to try and achieve that. And does battery storage technology figure in your overall calculations?
Thanks, John. Keith or colleagues?
Yeah, okay. I think we should be confident, John. This is, whilst it's hard and challenging within the scope of the project, I think it's for us collectively to work out how we get from A to B. So we should be confident. And particularly with the procurement piece, we should be absolutely confident that we should be able to procure 100% renewable energy. We obviously need to define when by, and it's complicated because everybody has their own procurement approaches that they use. But if we want to, despite the complexities of local government in London, I think we should aim to do that. And the art of the possible will be to how we can engage other public sector partners. The second point about battery storage, again, that is emerging, I think, more and more as part of the solutions for decentralised energy. Decentralised energy is moving on. Certainly boroughs across London are looking at different sources of energy and joining together other technologies like electric vehicle charging and solar and battery storage as part of the overall solution for decentralised energy. And different heat sources. So the underground I mentioned has been the one we've used in Islington. Across North London, we're looking at the heat offtake from the new energy from waste plant that's being developed by North London Waste Authority. And we're also looking locally at how we can draw energy from data centres in a particular pilot project we're testing at the moment, because there's a huge amount of waste heat available. I think stats indicate that something like 30% of London's heat is wasted at the moment. So if we can capitalise on that, that's a great opportunity. I don't know if Ash wants to add anything.
No, I think you covered it perfectly.
Right, thanks very much. I think there's another question in the chat, but perhaps we can answer that in the chat. That would be helpful, because then we can go over to the next program without losing too much more time. And that is over to Matthew Hill and Sarah Wright on low carbon transport. Thank you.
Thanks, Katharina. Hopefully everyone can hear me. For those that don't know me, Matthew Hill, I'm the Assistant Director at Kingston for Highways Transport and Reg Services. And I've got Sarah Wright with me as well, who's the Head of Public Realm at Westminster, and we are the two joint boroughs for this particular programme. If you can move the slides on, that'd be great. Yep, and again. So this is the low carbon transport programme, and again, yep. So just to recap a little bit, so going back to the 2019 statement declaration, low carbon transport programme ambition is to halve petrol and diesel road journeys 2020 to 2030. That's the headline, but I'm going to challenge people to think a bit more about that in what we're talking about now. And we've sort of added this subtext, which is about via combined measures that can restrict polluting journeys and incentivise sustainable and active travel options, ? And I'll come back to that in a minute. And what we're aiming to do really is to support all the boroughs to achieve the headline ambition, but we recognise obviously that requirements, resourcing, politics and all the other things will vary across the boroughs. So we're attempting to build flexibility into the action plan so that all boroughs can make use of it. Next slide. So just very briefly as background, so London national figures, obviously perhaps slightly different from London, but transport is one of the biggest factors in greenhouse gas emissions in the country. In terms of policy context, we've got the DfT's Decarbonising Transport policy paper that came out earlier this year, and obviously also we've got the national drive towards replacement of diesel and petrol vehicles from 2030 onwards. So all of that is sort of the wider policy context. And the next slide, please. So again, transport has actually become more of a problem in terms of the overall cake, as it were, of greenhouse gases over the last 30 years. That's really because obviously power generation has become much less of a problem with the move from coal to gas. So transport is one of the biggest areas that we need to address. And the next. And within that, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here to a certain extent, but within that, surface transport and surface passenger transport in particular is a very big contributor. So 23% of greenhouse gases down to surface transport. And next, please. Thank you. And of that, 59% down to cars. So that's where we need to target our efforts, in short. But I wouldn't dismiss, particularly in London, the next two there as well, which are heavy goods vehicles and vans. So there's a big element of logistics and delivery aspect to all this as well, I think. So think back to the headline, halve petrol and diesel journeys. So we can solve that just by electrification, can we? We can just get every petrol and diesel journey swapped onto an EV. Well, yes and no. I mean, that may help, but don't forget that this is in the wider context of a declaration that's aiming to achieve net zero. So that's the first point, and there's certainly some early research now that suggests that EV owners actually drive their vehicles more than internal combustion engine ones, quite possibly because they're either a combination of things like lower marginal cost, and also dare I say it, that car companies are keen to advertise the sort of guilt-free aspects of using an EV, so which encourages people to actually drive more. And of course, there's lots of other impacts as well, which we'll come on to. So the LGA quoted some research which was undertaken in Scotland, where they looked at how to meet an 80% target in reduction in emissions, so not net zero. Could it be done by changes to lifestyle? Could it be done by vehicle electrification, or in a combined scenario? And it was only in the combined scenario that you would get that 80%, let alone a net zero achievement. So a significant reduction in car mode share and length of trips, and a significant increase in active travel and bus, and a huge uptake of EVs, all by 2030, and we might get close. So that's the scale of the challenge we've got ahead of us. And just quickly, obviously there are co-benefits as well. So we all know the cost well, these can be quantified in different ways, but there are significant costs to London and the country of transport and traffic, air quality, noise, road safety, congestion, inactivity and lack of physical activity, and the regeneration and green growth agenda are all things that can benefit from this programme as well. And I'll hand over to Sarah now to talk about how far we've got so far.
Thanks very much, Matt. Yeah, I just want to give you a quick run through where we are in developing our action plan and our thoughts on the subject so far. So as you can see, obviously it's Kingston and Westminster are the joint boroughs, and we actually sort of took leadership of this early in the summer. So we're quite early on in our journey. And what we've done so far is we've gone out to the boroughs and engaged with them all and asked for their thoughts on where they would like support within this area of reducing vehicle and diesel journeys. And some of the stuff they've come back with are core themes, particularly around data, London-wide thinking about support and advocacy. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail later on. Do you want to go on to the next slide, Katharina? Some of the key things that we've picked up about that early engagement, though, in particular, this is a very, very crowded space, lots of duplicate knowledge, working groups at a strategic level and at borough levels with the types of projects that are being delivered and the kind of research that's going on. So we want to be really careful not to duplicate work and to ensure that as a programme we add value in this space, and obviously don't then duplicate some of the work within some of the other London Council programmes as well. So a lot of what we're looking at looks like it might be focused around best guidance and practice and providing sort of marketing material and support and advocacy from that perspective. We've gone to the next slide, thank you. So just from our setup, we've kind of developed a two-tier system. We've got a core steering group that we pulled together, which is the two boroughs, LOTAG, LEDNET, London Councils, TfL, and some consultancy support to try and focus and the delivery of the action plan. And this is supported by a reference group that met for the first time in mid-September. Thank you very much to all the boroughs that attended. The invitation is obviously still out there if anyone else would like to attend. And we've got a really, really good cross-section of both inner and outer London boroughs and political makeup and everything as well. So hopefully we've got really good representation there to feed into the development of our action plan as we go forward. So go on to the next slide, Katharina, thank you. So as kind of Matt said, you know, EVs are probably not the answer to everything, and we need to look at this in a slightly more holistic manner. And we've started to kind of break it down in these sort of areas of avoid, shift, improve, of different actions that we can take that will both impact on the type of vehicle that's on the road, but then also really importantly as well to hit some of the wider targets, the numbers of vehicles that are on the road, whether we can try and encourage people to avoid unnecessarily travel through sort of freight consolidation, areas like that, shift more people to sustainable modes of travel, active travel, public transport, particularly pertinent at the moment coming out of COVID with some of the concerns that people have got getting on public transport. That could be a good opportunity there. And then also improve the efficiency of the vehicles that are on the road, where we kind of feed into electric vehicles, but then also different elements like emission zones and parking policies so that we can make the network run more smoothly. And then alongside that, there's a really key element around data that we need to consider in a little bit more detail to understand the current emissions and plausible trajectories across central in and out of London so that we can actually measure the outcomes of the action plans that we want to put forward. And one of the key things that come back is a very strong need for an advocacy and a lobbying element to the work that we're doing. Should we go to the next slide? Thank you. So the emerging, where we are at the moment, we're just starting to develop the action plan, and these are kind of the early objectives that we're kind of looking at and hopefully develop a plan going forward to the end of this year into the early part of next year. So as I said before, a pan-London data framework to understand and track carbon emissions within the context of the decarbonisation goal is really important for us to understand what the benefits are of the actions that we're taking as boroughs and across London as a whole. So that's kind of the set the context in it. And I think there's also a need that's come forward to provide evidence for some of the smaller schemes within that to show how they feed into that wider data framework. So for example, if you're doing a freight consolidation program, how do you show the benefits of that program to make the case for actually supporting that in the first place, and how that feeds into the wider objectives of the scheme. And also, as I've mentioned before, a strong role here, we think, for lobbying government, potentially around funding, but it would have to be a very sort of focused area on what we're looking for, but particularly around messaging to increase confidence on the use in public transport and to avoid the car-led recovery that I mentioned earlier on. Just want to go on to the next last slide. There seems to be a call from boroughs to work more collaboratively on London-wide policies, particularly around parking, potentially road pricing, zero emission zones, elements like that, and the uptake of active travel. And I've mentioned before, reduce the number of emissions and freights and servicing jobs. So you can see there's lots and lots of different elements that kind of feed into this. And what we're just trying to unpick at the moment is the key ones that we need to focus on that will provide value. And also to make sure that we cover the whole of the gender and elements don't fall between the gaps between all the different programmes. One of the conversations I had previously, particularly around where the construction of transport programmes and the carbon input of delivering programmes, where that fits across this whole wider climate action programme. So there's an element of trying to identify the gaps there. And Matt and I did the same presentation this morning at LowTag, and we got some really good positive feedback from them as well, particularly in potentially looking at best practice in innovative funding sources and elements like that, and a lot of support, particularly around the active travel message to encourage people to take up sustainable forms of transport. So we're still open to ideas. I just want to go on to the last slide. So again, it's just trying to balance that objective where the headline one is to halve diesel and petrol journeys. But as I say, that's not the whole answer. That's got to be put alongside how we encourage modal shift and ensure the efficient running of the whole of London from a transport perspective. Some of the questions that we're still grappling with are resourcing, as I'm sure many of the other programmes are, and just trying to unpick exactly what our key objectives are. And to make sure that we're relevant and adding value to where we are. As I said before, we're hoping to, well, we've got another working group coming up in the next couple of months, and then be pulling the action plan together towards the end of the year. So happy to take any questions, or if you want to get involved, you know where Matt and I are as well. So thank you.
Great, thanks very much. We do have some time for a couple of questions. Can see John has got his hand up, and there are a couple of things in the chat I'll have a look at. But John, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. My understanding is that there are about 2.6 million ICE vehicles in London at the moment, and using sort of a back of a fag packet calculation, if we assume each vehicle is powered, has 75 kilowatts of power, and if you take into account diversity, then we're probably talking about 5.8 or 58.5 gigawatts of electrical power. Just so, so the question really is the low carbon transport program or plan to do with trying to remove all ICE vehicles so that we have full EV, which means, of course, does it also mean looking at reinforcing the network infrastructure to support electric vehicles in London? And will it be 2.6 million replacement? And secondly, would it also be, has any thoughts been put into how electric charging points, facilities, the numbers and the capacity, as there's a variety of different charging points from 7.2 to 50 kilowatt, sometimes up to 125 kilowatts, which obviously reduces the amount of time required to actually charge a vehicle. And then, so in other words, is that infrastructure being thought about in as part of this process?
Do you want to go or do you want me to go? That's right, we can't hear Matt, so I'll have a go. I think probably one of the important things that I kind of forgot to mention, and it fits into what I was talking about this being quite crowded space. There's already quite a lot of programs that are already leading on the rollout of EVs and charging points and numbers like that. So as a group, we are not planning on leading on that or promote, driving, not necessarily driving it forward, but not leading on that. I think there's a role that we need to look at closely about how we pull that information together so that we can start making the case and sort of start answering some of those questions that you're saying. But it's recognising that there's already lots of groups out there across London councils and London-wide that are delivering the infrastructure that have got that information. So we see part of our role here is pulling that information into a central area. And just with regards to removing all internal combustion engines, I think, as we said at the beginning, that's not going to solve our problem. If that was, our headline objective, if you like, was to halve diesel and petrol journeys. So again, that wouldn't be taking them all off, but that in itself is not going to get us to our target. So while obviously we're very, very supportive and we want to encourage the move over to electric vehicles, it's got to be married with an awful lot of other activities and events around that, trying to remove the need for travel in the first place, and then people to move to more sustainable modes of transport for us to hit our goals.
Thanks, Sarah. Julia, you had a question as well, and then
yes,
we'll go
and
on
thank
to the next
you.
one.
I'm in Richmond. You set out some of the concerns around electric vehicles not being a silver bullet, although they can be useful, particularly in terms of local air quality and so on. And I'm just thinking, as the years go by and as uptake increases, then we'll increasingly need to include consideration of recycling of batteries and how to deal with the end of life and make sure it's not an end, but it's part of the cycle. And it would be best, I think, to have a collective and coherent approach to this. And I just wondered if this is being looked at as part of a more holistic look at the carbon impact of electric vehicles.
That's a good question.
God, I don't know.
Sorry, so I found my unmute. So I mean, the short answer is very good point. I'm not sure if it's being looked at. It's not being looked at by us yet. Hopefully, someone somewhere in the country is thinking about it, because undoubtedly it's going to be a big issue. Yeah, absolutely. So, but I have to say, it's not something we've really thought about yet.
But it's a good point, and as we came on the sort of the whole life costing agenda has been mentioned in today actually on previous agendas as well, and I think it's an important consideration that we need to make sure we have considered in all of our programs. Actually, there will be some costs and some benefits in all of it. Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'm going to draw this bit to a close now. Thanks very much, Matt and Sarah. There's a couple of questions in the chat, so if you wouldn't mind just answering them in the chat, if you can, that'd be lovely. And we're now going over to Aled and Natalie at Low Carbon Development, please. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Ali Richard, Strategic Director of Sustainability Program at Hackney, and they'll soon hand you over to Natalie. But just to give you an overview, the purpose of the Low Carbon Development Program and the action plan is to secure low carbon buildings and infrastructure via borough planning by 2030. The goal is for all borough local plans to have policies and guidance that support low carbon development and adaptation to climate change. Hackney is the lead borough, but we were delighted with the attendance yesterday from other boroughs at the steering group, where the draft action plan was initially discussed. It hasn't been agreed yet, but we've taken comments on board. Now, we've had a lot of comments today regarding the need to sell the big picture to residents and businesses in terms of a holistic approach to mitigate climate change. It does seem, however, and we think we picked this up in our breakfast meeting, that this narrative sometimes is lost because many boroughs have had to be reactive to objections to individual initiatives, the predominantly LTNs, and I'm sure a lot of people on this conference would be quite scarred with what we've gone through over the last year, but it's all for a good cause. So ensuring communities are part of the climate change mitigation plans and have an understanding how the various climate action measures form parts of a coordinated plan is actually crucial, hence the role of planning. It is clear from the figures that was outlined earlier by the Mayor that the majority of residents in London are behind us in this, and we need to tap in more effectively this groundswell of support. Planning, therefore, has a pivotal role in this, as it brings together a whole range of climate change initiatives. Many of these exciting initiatives we've been discussing in the workshops today, such as green infrastructure, place streets, sustainable transport, green economy, green energy, low carbon developments, but they put it all together into a spatial plan which residents can relate to and understand how all these initiatives we're talking about fit together to create a sustainable community for the future and benefits to the community. Therefore, it is really crucial we develop an innovative engagement technique with communities, especially those hard to reach communities, in helping draft local plans and area master plans. This will be a key in order not just to tap in to the silent majority, but also those who feel excluded, and have the community buy-in addressing the climate emergency through the planning system. Therefore, the draft action plan in this work stream aims to deliver that and ensure a consistent approach to community engagement and to low carbon development policies and spatial planning across all London boroughs. One of the key challenges we've got amongst planning departments and building control departments across London is the upskilling of planning officers and surveyors, which will need to be a priority, which has been incorporated into the action plan, in order that the skill set is there to push forward with this agenda. Clearly, there's a huge amount of overlap with this work stream with the other 7 exciting work streams, in particular retrofit, low carbon transport and resilient and green. However, I'll hand you over now to Natalie, which will run through the initiatives which were discussed yesterday at the steering group, and I'll hand you over now.
Thanks, Aled. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. So we could move to the, sorry, we'll pause on that slide, back to the other slide for a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. Really great to be here. I'm Natalie Broughton, I'm the Head of Planning and Building Control at Hackney. And thank you for that introduction, Aled. So I'm just going to elaborate a bit more on that context that Aled just provided. But I think it's worth just pausing for a second on this, because this slide, what is low carbon development? This was aimed at inspiring you all, and there was lots of discussion earlier on this morning about the role that we have in inspiring people. So there's a number of examples of some low carbon development within this image, some from an international context, some from a national context, and some within London. I think we used a Hackney example. So yeah, hopefully that sets the flavour of what we can do through our low carbon work stream in inspiring people. Move to the next slide. So I think Aled has covered most of this just in his initial introduction. So I think the purpose of this slide was just to highlight it's not about just the individual developments. It's about the wider programme and the collective influence we can have by ensuring kind of all development is low carbon. So we move to the next slide. I wanted to really start by talking about why we can make a difference. And through this low carbon work stream and this action plan, I think it's both a combination of the influence and the impact that we can have. So I'll spend a few minutes just going through that. So start off with, we've got control and influence. So we obviously have building regulations, which sets the initial kind of baseline. And we're very fortunate with this particular work stream to have the London Plan, which has already some very good policies on low carbon development, which applies across London. And that really gives us the control and influence to start to make a change. And of course, boroughs have the ability to develop their own local policies which reflect local circumstances. So an example of this in Hackney is that in our recently adopted local plan, we introduced a policy for zero carbon for all development, not just major development. And that really reflects the local circumstances in Hackney, where we have a large proportion of development that comes forward for small scale development, so infill development. So we wanted to make sure that we made a real difference and captured that development. So that kind of gives you a flavour for the kind of power we have. In terms of the, obviously we also have the ability to influence area-based plans as well, and that kind of goes back to Ali's earlier point about the collective impact that we can have. Moving on from that, obviously we have the decision-making function and have the power to influence at the pre-application stage in particular, and that moves me on to the point around innovation. So we have an opportunity to really engage with developers and architects at that early pre-application stage, to work with them to look at designs that can innovate and inspire and deliver low carbon. It's a really important point. I'm not going to talk too much about the economic benefits because that was discussed earlier this morning, but obviously that's a key positive driver for this work stream, and obviously there's a session later on which will look at the green economy in more detail. I did just want to flag though, as part of that, we've obviously got the issue around fuel poverty, which again was raised earlier on today. And I think that's being able to deliver low carbon development, low carbon new development is particularly important in the context of fuel poverty, whereby we have very ambitious targets in London around affordable housing delivery. So it's really very important that we can maximise opportunities to deliver low carbon development, reduce energy bills, and that coupled with affordable housing delivery can have a real difference. So in terms of the impact, I suppose the retrofit section will tell you about, most of our housing stock is already there. So obviously the retrofit element is really important. But equally important, 10% of CO2 emissions that are generated come from the construction process. So really important to note the impact we can have through ensuring new development is low carbon. And then in terms of the scale of the development, obviously there's lots of development planned across London. We have a new London plan which sets out targets for new residential homes. So 52,000 new homes be delivered each year, and there's a real opportunity to ensure that those are low carbon. And of course, in addition to that, you have the various infrastructure and commercial development that will come forward as well. And then finally, the point around inspiration. So it's a little collection of those images there. I think this work stream has great potential to inspire. These iconic buildings can be really inspirational, but think of these, a collection of these, or this type of development in one particular area or across London can really help inspire a generation and show what difference we can make. Can move to the next slide. Okay, so this is a bit on the scope of what we can achieve. And again, kind of Ali just covered some of this already, but just to go into a bit more detail. So I think the first thing we think of in terms of low carbon development is around zero carbon targets and how buildings perform once they're built. And I think that's already quite well embedded into policy, and certainly into the London Plan policy. I guess one area that we need to focus on is, where the differences are across boroughs, and whether there's scope to do some further research to implement policies and ensure that they can be delivered. And I'll touch more upon that later. So that's the kind of the operational performance element. And then, of course, we've got the embodied carbon, so the carbon that goes into the building materials and into the manufacture and construction process. And I think that's, again, is something that we need to consider and something that's within the scope of this work stream. Linked to that, I think, then is the circular economy, and then looking at the whole life cycle carbon assessment. So making sure that we are not only focusing on the end use of the building, but also that full process of construction, and then ultimately that kind of the recycling element and what happens when a building comes to the end of its lifetime. And then, just back one more. We've got resilience. So low carbon development is also about ensuring that buildings can adapt to climate change. So we've got that also forms part of the scope. So from what we've got quite a short title, actually low carbon development can contain a whole range of different elements. And then as part of that kind of resilience, you've got the green infrastructure and biodiversity gains that can be generated through new development. Next slide. Okay, so I've got a couple of slides now just to talk about how we can get to, I've put zero carbon here, perhaps it should be low carbon. I'll just spend a few minutes just talking about these, and as part of this, I want to talk about some of the emerging actions that were discussed at our steering group just yesterday. So we focus around 4 key areas. So collaborate, innovate, simplify and upskill. So we'll take the first 2 first. So collaborate is about working across planning policy, development management and building control, and understanding a common approach and measurable outcomes. We've got here the need to engage with communities, which Aled touched upon, and industries to understand the barriers and opportunities. The third point there is, again, a common theme that's come up with all of the presentations is the need to establish the links between the other programmes. And then the fourth bullet point that we've got here is about cross-boundary initiatives. So making sure that we look at the opportunities to deliver across borough boundaries. So I think we do well in London in terms of planning for London as a whole, and boroughs obviously do well looking at their own individual policies, but is there a bit of work to be done on looking at cross-boundary issues and whether there could be a sub-regional approach to policy making? So in terms of the actions coming out of that, and as I say, these are very much emerging actions because we just had our initial steering group yesterday. Action number 1 is to undertake an audit of borough local plans and understand where the differences in policy lie, and understand the reasons for that as well. So that's a kind of an action that we ideally want to take quite early on in the programme. Action number 2 arising from this is to produce and publish a community engagement guidance document. So those are kind of the initial actions emerging from this collaborate work stream. Moving on to innovate, and this is very much linked to the initial kind of research that we would do, looking at how we can really push the boundaries and develop policies that can be implemented and monitored. So develop low carbon research and guidance to enable boroughs to develop their policies. So the actions arising from this are firstly to commission research. Research particularly around viability, technical research on new technologies. I think there's a real need from initial discussions we've had with our working group and steering group to identify constraints and barriers around viability, and potential issues around compliance with building regulations is something that has come up. And then also, as part of that research, understanding any potential conflict between our objectives around low carbon operational development and how we need to also address the issue of embodied carbon. Are those two elements compatible, and how can they be compatible? Moving on from that, action number 4 is to develop best practice in decision making and guidance on boroughs and how to implement the policy. So it's very important that we have the policy, but it's also making sure that we can implement that and looking at how we can get some best practice in place for that. Action number 5, moving on from that, is to develop best practice around monitoring. So looking at how we can actually monitor what is built. Is it in accordance with policy? How much development is approved through carbon offset funding? How much is actually being achieved, for example, through the fabric of buildings? And I think that's an area that we really want to explore further, including the possibility of boroughs adopting agreed performance indicators around that. And then finally, with the innovate, and I think this goes back to my earlier point around inspiring and making sure that we push the boundaries around design. Action 6 is to establish a recognised scheme or awards to showcase low carbon development. It's really important to inspire and promote innovation. We can move on to the next slide. So simplify. I think there's a balance to be struck in terms of how much of this can be achieved through a pan-London approach and how much needs to be bespoke within individual boroughs. But I think what we want to do is simplify where we can, where it's appropriate, a pan-London approach. And as part of that, push for effective national policy and legislation in both planning and building control. So in terms of our actions that are arising, action number 7 is to develop a pan-London policy on aspects of low carbon development not already covered by the London Plan. I suppose as part of that, that's also looking at any policy guidance that can be given around area-based plans. Action number 8, just on that second bullet point there, is to ensure effective lobbying for national planning and building control reforms. And as part of that, we need to identify a forward plan of opportunities to lobby and respond to consultations so that we can make timely responses to that.
Natalie, just briefly, can I check how many more slides you've got? Because you've got the allotted time now, but I can give you a couple of more minutes.
I've got 2, and they're very brief.
Okay, lovely, thanks.
And then finally, upskill. So this is a really, really important one. And I think this is an area that most boroughs are facing particular challenges on at the moment. So there's a need to boost understanding and skills within local authorities, create confidence amongst professionals and what can be achieved. So our final action around this is to provide recommendations to boroughs to increase the skills, looking at various training initiatives and programmes for even councillors and officers. So that's I'll finish there on that slide. If we just move to the next slide. So it's very much a partnership approach. There's various different types of people that need to be involved, including communities. Sorry, my S has dropped with the conversion of the PDF from communities. I just wanted to touch very briefly on what we've done so far. So we're probably, like other programmes, quite early on in our journey still. We've got an established working group and an established steering group. And we're really pleased with the number of boroughs that have been interested in joining that. So we have Tower Hamlets, Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington and Chelsea, Barnet, Richmond and Wandsworth, Newham, Lambeth and the GLA, all part of that, which is excellent. So we've had our initial steering group meeting and do have a programme to take to get a draft action plan finalised by the end of the year. It's a very challenging programme. We're quite fortunate in that there was an earlier working group that did a lot of the initial work in establishing what the actions are. So we think that that target is achievable for getting the action plan finalised by the end of the year. We will bring in various other partners into the working group as we progress with the action plan. And these are just a list of the types of partners that need to be involved. And just finally, on the last slide, I suppose our ask is to get involved. So if we're still at the very early stages in scoping this out, although we do have quite a clear direction in where we want to go with it. But if you do want to get involved in this project, then please contact me or Alid. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. I haven't seen any burning hands up there, which is probably just as well. So if there are any questions, if you wouldn't mind putting them in the chat, we're now slightly behind schedule, not too much, we're okay. But if you put them in the chat and then perhaps Natalie and Aled can answer them in the chat, that would be helpful. I'm quite keen for us to have a quick comfort break. So just for 5 minutes so that people have a quick break away from the screen, can move around a little bit, that sort of stuff. So if we convene back here in 14:37, I think it is. So if we have a 5-minute quick comfort break, and then we'll come back at 14:37 and we'll hear from the other 3 programs that are still outstanding. Thanks very much. Hi everyone, I'm making it out to be now 14:37. I can see a couple of blank pictures, but hopefully colleagues will come back soon. So thank you. I enjoyed just moving around a little bit actually. So yes, hope that was okay. So we are now got 3 more programs to present, and the next ones are Alex and Matthew on One World Living. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to top and tail this, and Matthew's going to do the mainstay of the presentation. So I'm Alex Dewsnap. I'm Harrow's Director of Strategy and Partnerships. So whilst Matthew presents on the One World Living programme, some thoughts just around some questions which are worthwhile thinking about, because we'll pose them at the end. So for you to all think about how we can identify the barriers to change at scale, and what role can local authorities play in helping to unlock or remove those barriers. So if you think about those as Matthew's going through the slides, and as we enter into Q&A, I'm conscious that we've got a number of the other leads that are on the call today. So very happy to bring them in if that doesn't create too much chaos for you in terms of trying to chair the whole thing. But yeah, Matthew, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Matthew Adams. I'm the climate lead at Harrow. If we just move on to the next slide, Katharina, please. So just a very quick overview of the programme. We've called it the One World Living programme for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But this looks at consumption emissions across London. Obviously, consumption emissions can include quite a wide range of things, including transport and energy. But because those things are being dealt with by the other themes, as we're hearing, our focus initially is on 4 main areas. So we're looking at food, which is obviously probably the single biggest area in terms of emissions, textiles, plastics and electricals and electronic goods. We've also got within our purview, although we haven't, this will be more of a second phase of work to develop, is aviation as a sort of transport theme, which probably has a certain amount of political dimension. So that's partly why we're leaving it for the moment. But it is obviously a significant part of the consumption emissions profile of quite a large number of Londoners, and international travel is due to the nature of our makeup of our city, a significant part. So we will be dealing with that, but not in the first phase of this work. The overall ambition is to achieve a 2/3 reductions in emissions across those areas by 2030. And this really comes from a report that was done by the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in 2019, which estimated that in order to meet our 1.5 degree target, we would need globally to reduce emissions to about 2.5 tonnes per capita consumption emissions. And at the moment, just to give you an idea, some of you will have seen the Leeds data that's been produced recently on consumption emissions for London. Just take Harrow as an example. We're fairly typical. Our residents, on average, each of them produce about 8.6 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year from their consumption of goods and services and their lifestyles as a whole. So it does demonstrate quite graphically that level of reduction that's required. It's a big ambition and a big programme with big reach. Just in terms of the mechanics of it, Harrow's leading it, assisted closely by the West London Waste Authority. But because it is a big programme, and each of those areas is a substantive piece of work in its own right and requires a lot of expertise, we've brilliantly got 4 other leads involved as well, other boroughs. So Hackney is helping us with food, leading the working group on that work stream, Hammersmith and Fulham on electricals, West London Waste working with Wandsworth on textiles, and Richmond on plastics. And I think some of those colleagues are in the room as well. So if there's any specific questions, I'm sure they'll be willing to hear them as well. Next slide, please. So why One World Living? Well, as we're discovering, consumption is complicated, lots of change of complex systems involved, lots of upstream and downstream impacts from wherever you are in that system. But at its heart, it's a simple and a powerful way of framing it. It is simply that we do have one planet, and we've got to learn to live within its resources. And of course, not only us, but all the rest of the natural world that we depend upon utterly for our food, clean air, clean water, medicines, etc., all the things that make human life possible. And if we just move on to the next slide, one way of showing this quite powerfully is this work that was done by the Global Footprint Network. It's done annually. This data is a few years old now, but I think the position is not certainly not gotten any better. And if you look at the left-hand graphic, it shows, this looks at the biocapacity of the Earth, so how much physical resources we require to live as we are living at the moment. And you can see the UK doesn't come off particularly well there. For our population, it takes roughly four land masses equivalent to the UK to support our population. And then on the right-hand side, if everybody lived like we do in the UK, we'd be using roughly 3 Earths worth of resources. So you can see there not only the scale of the issue at the moment, but also that this is particularly a first world issue. You know, the first world countries developed countries are by far the biggest consumers, but also, of course, have the biggest opportunity to reduce their impacts as well. Next slide, please. So taking out our 4 themes in turn, plastics is included as a slight late addition to the programme, partly because it doesn't have the greatest impact in terms of pure emissions, but of all the themes, it probably perhaps has the most traction with the public. And part of the reason for that is its effects have been shown to us become very visible through images like this, through the blue planet effect, it's so called. And obviously, aside from the emissions side, the level of waste and pollution that's associated with disposable plastics has really been brought home to people, I think. One of the interesting reflections on the working group so far that I think has come out recently is part of the challenge for us is telling a slightly different story about plastics. It's not just waste and pollution, but also that plastics are a valuable commodity, a valuable resource that we should be looking to keep in use for as long as possible, and then of course fully recycle and remanufacture at the end. So it's going to be interesting to see how, as we develop that work stream, what the role of local authorities can be in telling that story. And there's obviously a significant issue that's been identified as well particularly around flexible packaging, the packaging that's used in our supermarkets that we all deal with as local authorities, as waste authorities. I know that group at the moment is working, thinking about what is other points of leverage that we can really, as local authorities, club together around to influence the amount of plastic that's coming through our waste system. Next slide, please. So this is quite a creative image. Some of you will be have seen it before, and it aims to do, I think, really what the image is, the blue planet effect for food, if you like. This was an image that was put together as part of a campaign called Small Change, Big Difference, run by London and WRAP a few years ago. And it really brings home, I think, the level of food waste that still at the moment is happening across London. It represents 3.75 tonnes of edible food waste just from one street, equivalent 14 households. That's over 900,000 tonnes a year across London as a whole. And again, this is waste that's coming through our waste streams. Looking at, I know the group at the moment is really focusing on what are the barriers that's stopping people using that waste and using it in a productive way. And it comes down, I think, is a lot of these things around skills, knowledge, and providing easy ways for people to behave differently. And one of the biggest things probably that we can all do as local authorities is actually to make sure food waste is separated, because once it is, you can start to really get a feel for the level of, as a household, the level of waste that you're producing individually. Next slide, please. And one of the key things I think that in all of these areas is how attitudes can influence habits. And there's a couple of neat examples here from the textiles work that the group has been doing. On the right hand side, that example from 2018, amazing 183 million items of baby clothes that are kept in people's lofts around the country. And this was the spur for a bit of work between Hubbub and Mothercare, the children's retailer a couple of years ago. And they looked at, well, why are all those items there? And they found out that it was probably because the vast majority of people had a sentimental attachment to those clothes and they wanted to keep them, and they didn't want to devalue them, their research showed, by giving them to a charity shop, depersonalize them in that way. So the scheme that arose out of that was called Gift a Bundle, which was run in quite a number of Mothercare stores over the recent years, and that's where parents can club together and put together a bundle of baby clothes with a personal message that is donated to a local family. So very much sort of keeping that emotional attachment to the clothes, but redirecting it in a positive way that means those items are not sitting in the loft, but are actually out there working in the world and benefiting other people. And a bit close to home, that the left-hand example is some research that was done by a clothing manufacturer that showed, amazingly, 1.4 million wearable school uniforms are thrown away every year by UK households. 80% of parents buy new generally, and the surprising statistic for me was that nearly half don't want their children wearing second-hand clothing. So I think the challenge for us as local authorities, which I know our group is looking at, is we don't procure school uniforms generally as local authorities, but we do have significant convening power in our local areas to get schools together and indeed retailers and other businesses locally to start to look at this and what are the barriers there? Why don't people want to reuse second-hand clothing, and how can a different story be told and different mechanisms be put in place to enable people to reuse school uniforms? There's a big win there, I think, potentially for London, if we can get everybody on the same page. Next one, please. Just quickly, electronics, we're focusing particularly on small electrical goods there, and again, 55 million unused phones estimated sitting in unused drawers, and I've got a couple in my own drawers, and the group's working through at the moment the barriers for those, and again looking at sort of fears around loss and security of data, not understanding devices' potential, lack of knowledge, and indeed access to convenient ways to pass them on to other people. So the group's working with a number of organisations that are doing exactly that. The photograph there is from an organisation called Ready Tech Go, which you see the young person there receiving their refurbished phone. And I think as local authority, we've got to sort of look at what resources we have as a group to enable the spaces for that sort of activity to happen. Maybe it's initially kickstarting with some finance, maybe it's providing some actual physical spaces for reuse to happen. But those barriers, I think, are pretty common ones across the whole programme. Next slide, please. So I'm conscious of time. What this adds up to for the programme is we want to take a bottom-up approach, and it's what one of our former leaders in Harrow called the little big things. So the presumption that it's taken billions of individual actions to get us to this consumption problem that we're facing at the moment. It's going to take billions of individual actions to find the solutions as well. Next slide, please. And just lastly, just to close it really, we're looking at trying to identify across the programmes, and this comes back to the questions Alex posed, what are those points of intervention that we can really make a difference on as local authorities? This is a model of change that we're using. It's not the only one, and of course we all know change doesn't happen in neat ways, but the basic presumption is that if we start to change attitudes, small actions and good practice are multiplied, you build that pressure for systemic change, you get lobbying and demands of new markets, and then you get structural changes occur, and then gradually you can normalise those behaviours and move on to the next level of ambition. If you just click forward, Katharina, please. We can then look at where local authorities can make a difference in this circle of change. And it might be about telling the story, political leadership at the beginning, good information, taking steps as local authorities to on our own policies around procuring goods. Big role, I think, for lobbying for upstream change where required. We've got a big voice as 33 boroughs joined together. And then as you get to the left-hand side of that diagram, we can start to obviously implement those changes through changes in waste and our own services. And on the top left there, I think is quite important as well. Our own ambitions, net zero strategies will then help to drive that next cycle of change to happen. I won't dwell on these couple of slides, Katharina, because of time. So if we just forward to the last slide, that would be helpful. And we'll come back to the questions that Alex posed. So we've got a little bit of time if people want to ask anything. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yes, we've got about 5 minutes for discussions. Any immediate thoughts from colleagues on these 2 questions that were posed from Harrow colleagues? Silence. So Zach, do you think we can get the questions back up? Because I've not forgotten them.
So there's one about barriers, and then what role can councils play?
Oh, yes.
Hi there, Matthew. Yeah, it's Mary Claire from Havering.
Hi, Mary Claire.
Hello.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, you went about it, parents not wanting their children to wear second-hand clothes. I mean, to be honest, often that will come from the children themselves, especially when they hit a certain age. I mean, I know my daughter wouldn't tolerate wearing a second-hand school uniform. Maybe when they're little, yeah, I did manage to get her to wear sort of clothes that people had sort of shared around, but it's more coming from the children or teenagers, I would say. They're quite difficult to force to do anything. And often the school uniforms aren't very good quality, so they do actually deteriorate. Especially blazers and things, you know, they get saggy and holes in the elbows, and you know, they're not really reusable, some of them, and some of the schools have quite a strict policy on being very smart, so it's not quite as simple as that. Just sort of an input from a mum of a teenager. I just sort of, I'd throw that in there. But maybe if the materials they were made of were more sustainable, that would be good, because I mean, our schools recently, they used to have a really good quality school uniform, but they've reduced it because a lot of parents have complained about the cost of it. So they've reduced the quality to make it cheaper. Yeah, but the mother care thing is really good, I think, but bringing in a bundle and with the baby clothes.
Yeah,
so it wasn't really a question, it was just a comment.
Yeah, thank you. And they're exactly the sort of issues I think we would need to get everybody in the room to talk through, and to get the views of parents and schools and manufacturers as well.
I mean, I think a lot of schools do have secondhand. They do have days where they sell secondhand clothes, and they do a lot actually. You know, so I think some people do buy some stuff, you know, like PE kit or, you know, various things that are okay. You know, so they do actually do a lot. Of schools are already doing quite a lot. So people will sort of maybe mix and match rather than. Just
I think part of this as well is. Sorry, Mary Claire. I think part of this is trying to identify those areas where there are less barriers, because I think you've just identified, you know, as a father of a 16-year-old as well, you know, the peer pressure in teenagers is one thing that actually we're probably not going to resolve very much overnight, but actually thinking about some of those other things around textiles where actually there could be a second-hand market, and the baby clothes and plastic example, where actually some of that's just about facilitating where there's a will already, rather than trying to go up against some of these things with big barriers already.
Yep. Yes, thanks. We've also got Asma and Julia, please, who want to come in. Asma.
Yeah, so I'm from Tower Hamlets. I'm a councillor in Tower Hamlets, and I think the uniform one is a big thing here in Tower Hamlets with so many deprived families. And we hear from families a lot about how expensive it is sometimes, and the growth of children. Sometimes in a year you have to renew the uniform twice. And so I guess my question is how can we package this in a way where we're able to help as a local council be part of that and promote it maybe London-wide. And that same thing goes with the mother care. I thought that was such an amazing example of an initiative, and I'd love Tower Hamlets to be part of that, to be honest.
Thanks, Asma. Julia, and then we can come back on it.
Yeah, I think it was it Marie Claire? She made some very relevant points about uniform. It doesn't last well. The sleeves unravel. I've got 3 sons, so I do get second and third wear out of uniform. But once we've finished with it, I wouldn't pass it back to anybody to wear. However, I'm a purchaser of secondhand clothes, but that's a question of what's acceptable to your children. And I think that's right. As you become a bit more clothes conscious, things change for you. But I wondered about tackling it at the other end, when perhaps, you know, you think of a fashion student who might be very interested in the styles of the 70s or the 80s, or, you know, the distant history of when I was growing up, and that what we might think of as being a cast off or second hand could also be described as chic or vintage or precious or historic. And then it gets a slightly different value as long as it's been cared for and it's presented in the right shop window. It becomes much more appealing. So I think how we describe things is quite important, and we do need to separate out what's high quality from what really is just not fit for anyone else to wear, but might have some other use as a deconstructed textile remade into some other form that's useful to us. And another way of looking at recycling and clothing is, again, to use a personal example, I have leggings that are made apparently from the pellets of recycled plastic bottles. I don't know how they do it, but they seem to. So there's other links into some of these waste streams that we're talking about are very much interconnected. And on the appeal of quirky or really interesting clothing, rather than just buying something from a chain store, West London Waste Authority a couple of years ago had a competition to win a very exotic looking wedding dress that had been made from sort of pre-loved materials, and that was another way to lure people in to think of it slightly differently. So not really a question, just a series of anecdotes and observations.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, that's really interesting. I know the colleagues leading that textile stream are on the call, and I think that story and what story we tell about those clothes makes a massive difference to how they're perceived by people. So as well as the practical things about how long they last and what they're made of. So yeah, thank you for that input. Appreciate it.
Great, yes, thanks very much. And the chat got going quite a bit as well. Sorry, I haven't been able to follow it all, but there's quite a lot going on in the chat too. So if perhaps you can have a look after this presentation now and see whether there's any questions to be answered. That'd be great. Okay, well, thanks very much, Matt and Alex. That was really insightful, and certainly the children's clothes got people going. We're now hearing from Victoria on the green economy, please. Thank you.
Hi, Katharina. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm Victoria Lawson. I'm the Executive Director for Environment, Culture and Customer Services at the London Borough of Hounslow. My colleague Wayne Stevenson was due to join me. He's not feeling very well, so I'm doing this solo. Katharina, are you sharing the slides?
Yes, I think Zach is.
Thank you, Zach. I've been really ambitious and I've put loads of slides together, so I'm going to go through them as the colleagues who are on the call it will be familiar. So in Hounslow, we're leading the work stream on building a green economy for London. So next slide. So we've matched the ambition from the GLA and the Green New Deal, and that's about doubling the size of London's green economy. We are, after all, one London, and so it's really important that we're pushing all of our momentum in the same direction. Next slide. So part of our thinking was around what are the challenges that the economy across London is now facing. So obviously there's the impact of COVID and exposing the inequalities in the capital, and how we take advantage of emerging funding to support a transition to a low carbon economy, how we can stimulate green roles in a range of different sectors, but also create sufficient pathways and careers to support a low carbon economy. And also, I guess, how we can work together across London to sort of galvanise around particular image. Next slide. So we came up with the big idea. So we want to create a low carbon economy for London. We think this will be focused on 4 key areas, so jobs and skills, business and enterprise, innovation, and tackling inequalities. And we'd really want the programme to demonstrate, effective job creation and business creation in the low carbon and green sector, working through others around the skills and education pathways. The opportunity, I think, that we're going to need to think about in London in particular, and in particular parts of London, around that transition of skills and businesses into new and emerging green or low economy sectors, how we can be innovative and think differently, and how we can use this as a moment in time, a generational opportunity to tackle inequalities and increase access and opportunity. Next slide. So we've outlined these as some of the potential benefits. You may have other ideas and thoughts, and throughout this presentation, really welcome to hear this. It's a big and wide-ranging programme, and I think that's one of the particular challenges we face in pulling this together. So potential benefits, I think one of the key things we've noticed, particularly in West London, is the need for sort of resilience in our economy. And how we could stimulate new sectors, but also this thing around jobs creation, job transition, skill transition, and the like. Next slide. So we've split our programme so far into sort of 4 key work streams, and I'll go through each one individually about where we've got to and what we're planning to do next. So that's around vision, data and evidence, how we innovate and engage, and ultimately come up with our roadmap for delivery. Next slide. So firstly, big shout out to all the colleagues on the call from Kingston, Sutton, Hackney, Kensington, Chelsea, Tower Hamlets, Hammersmith and Fulham, and London councils who've been working alongside us. We really appreciate your contributions. So next slide. So first thing we've been looking at is how we can create a clear understanding and definition of the green economy, what the foundations of that needs to look like for this programme. Any identification, I guess, and understanding of international and national best practice, and how we can bring different stakeholders together to create that compelling vision for this particular programme. Next slide. So we talked about this in our workshop this morning, and we've had a sort of an attempt at it in Hounslow, and it'll be good to get people's perspectives on it. But we're really keen that we have quite a broad definition of what a green economy, recognising the different potential contributions, and for us, some of the areas that we were looking at were around green skills, enterprise, business, finance, investment, operations, and transition. So I guess our starter definition is on the next slide, Zach. So it's any activity that directly or indirectly contributes to London achieving a net zero, promoting businesses and achieving equality of opportunity and inclusion. Next slide. So we've started as a programme to start looking at the range of different evidence available, and I'm going to give you some of the highlights so far. There's a huge amount of work happening across London to understand the different aspects that would make up a green economy. The GLA have been doing a lot of work. We're expecting some information or work from Centre London Forward, who've been doing a huge amount on green skills. Important, I think, for this programme is to understand both the supply and the demand for the green economy, so that one feeds the other, and also looking at that opportunity around potential growth sectors that will drive the green economy, but also being very clear about the traditional sort of vulnerable sectors, so that we can make sure that we're making those connections, and also that sense of speed of transition and how we can create the right conditions. And then once we've done that sort of data and evidence piece, if there's anything where we think there's gaps that we need to understand in order to move our programme forward. Next slide. So Zach, keep your finger on the slide button, because I'm going to go through these figures at some pace. So this is sort of the national perspective at the moment on the green economy. So 206 billion, 7.4% growth, and 1.2 million people currently employed. Next slide. The UK investment strategy for net zero really started to outline the scale of opportunity change. And I guess I put in challenge about how ready we are for the future, but this slide gives an indication of the estimation of the low carbon workforce in England, expecting to increase by almost 500,000 by 2050. My personal view is that will be significantly accelerated by a range of programmes that government are putting in place around energy efficiency and electrification of vehicles. Next slide. We also know that the industry is changing. You know, COVID has had a significant impact. Brexit may well do. New technologies emerging in a transition towards green industry. So this is sort of a slide potentially demonstrating those sectors that are in decline and those that are in potential growth. Next slide. But also understanding the impact that it's having right across London in terms of claimants. So you see claimants are up by 8% in London and 6% nationally, not surprising given the impact of COVID. Next slide. We've also been looking at what that looks like when you break that down by age group, impacting, not surprisingly, on young people and older people. Next slide. And the same as well around those staff that are actually on a payroll, and what that might mean in the future potentially for things like business enterprise, which was something we were talking about in the workshop this morning. Next slide, Zach. But also there's opportunity, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to just briefly mention the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission. So there's a real opportunity about how we can connect need with opportunity investment. This is a piece of work that's been led by London Council's Core Cities and Connected Places Catapult, but in essence it's saying there's a 206 billion investment need across London and the other key cities in the UK. But if you look across the top in terms of the sectors, should that investment begin to materialise, what does that mean in terms of our ability to respond in terms of skills, pathways into particular employment, and what it might mean for our individual borough or London-wide economy. Next slide. So this is a piece of work that's going to be launched at COP26. Unsurprisingly, it demonstrates that domestic retrofit presents the greatest investment need. And I know you'd have heard earlier today about the fantastic work that has been happening across London on retrofit. So again, there's connections, I think, across this programme with all of the other programmes mentioned today about how we make that, I guess, connection and interface around supply demand. Next slide. Looking to the future, we're really keen to make sure that we have a really clear programme of innovation and engagement, and how we might use concepts around innovation labs to really bring a range of different boroughs, partners, academics, communities together to look at how do we actually start to identify I guess a programme for delivery. Where might there be fantastic flagships or demonstrator projects already happening across London? How can we scale that up? How can we share that information? And how we might be able to then use that to create a network across London. Next slide. And then ultimately we want to come up with a roadmap for delivery. Really keen to make sure that we can monitor and evaluate impact, and building upon that conversation about the UK CCIC, what's an investment strategy for this? What are the opportunities post COP26? And our next group meeting should be in November. And then next slide. Just finally finishing on some of the outcomes that we're seeking. They can support London-wide efforts to be carbon neutral by 2030, how we can create a compelling narrative for the programme, how we can understand and respond to supply, the same with demand, what does that look like in terms of business and business development, what we can do to help us individually and collectively, and how we can work across the other programmes to identify opportunities. And I think that's my final slide. I think the next one just says, any questions? So
lovely, thanks very much, Victoria. That was a whistle-stop tour.
Lots of information there.
Lots of information there. So we do have some time for a couple of questions, if there are any burning ones. I think the chat was still preoccupied with children's clothing mainly. But are there any questions?
That's okay. Are there any questions? Because sometimes this feels like quite a challenging programme to put some shape to. If there are any economists on the call, I'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Okay, there doesn't seem to be anything forthcoming, which is fine. We'll go into the next program presentation, and I know there was a question in the chat earlier about sharing the slides, and I will confer back to Kate and Zach, but if everybody said that they're happy with sharing the slides, then I don't see any problems with doing that. So we'll get back to you on that. But over to Tom now to talk about the resilient and green work strand.
Thank you very much, Katharina. Can you hear me okay? Great, thank you. Well, I've got 2 kids at primary school, so I have not yet started the secondary school argument over used clothing. So I look forward to that coming up in a few years' time. But we'll move on from that. So I'm here this afternoon to talk to you about Resilient and Green London. My name is Tom Sharland. I'm from Southwark Council. I'm the Climate Change Programme Lead. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover today. So we're talking about working collaboratively to ensure a resilient and green city of the future. So a bit of background to the working group. Talk briefly about the action plan we're putting together, the recent progress that we've had in our working group, and then finally, and probably most importantly, opportunities for collaboration and co-working going forward. Next slide, please. So just to give a bit of background, so there were actually only originally 6 programs, which we've just heard from this afternoon. Resilient and Green was added as a late addition in March 2020. That was really because it was recognised that there was a lack of adaptation across the other programs, and it wasn't something that was adequately being picked up. It's great that we've had this focus on net zero, and that's coming through really strongly, and you can see really positive action on the net zero agenda. But in terms of adaptation and resilience, it's often left slightly behind. That was the feeling. So that graph there, each of those blue bars is a council's climate action plan in London. And it's the spread of green and resilient actions within those climate action plans. So you can see at the top of the scale, some boroughs out there have about a quarter of their actions that sit across the resilient and green agenda, right down to some boroughs who don't have any or have very few at all. So it's a very mixed picture in terms of how much the current climate action plans talk about resilience and a green city. Next slide, please. Just to drill down into that in a bit more detail. So each of those, hopefully you can see that is the actions around resilient and green, so a bit more specific detail, which is based on London Council's research, which is incredibly useful. That big bar at the bottom is tree planting. So far and away, the main action within climate action plans that boroughs have identified and are actively progressing is around tree planting. So that yellow line is the percentage of published action plans where that action appears. So 80% have something around tree planting. It then drops all the way down to about a third of climate action plans that have something around biodiversity and sustainable urban drainage. But then beyond that, it's a very mixed picture. So there's quite a lack of consistency across London about what we're collectively saying we're going to do to deliver a green and resilient city in the future. So a real opportunity to work collaboratively, to share learning and to make sure that we're all starting from a really good place. Next slide, please. Just to take a step back, I mean, I know probably everyone on this call knows this, but why is this important? I think it was really interesting to hear those stats at the start of the day about how awareness from Londoners and the want for action has changed so much in a year. I think it was sort of from 50% to 90%, such a substantial change. And that's probably in large part because we are now seeing climate change in our city. You work in London as I do, no doubt you've seen it. In this summer, we obviously had severe flooding. A month later, we had the Met Office declaring, I think, its first extreme weather warning, and those were a month apart. And this is the kind of city that, the issues that our city is going to have to deal with. So there's some pretty sobering facts coming out recently from the Mayor of London and the GLA around predicted flooding levels by 2030, potentially a quarter of stations in the capital being at risk of flooding. There's massive impacts it's going to have on people's well-being and just the way in which the city functions. So that you probably saw last week, the Environment Agency came out with their third adaptation report, and this is again pretty sobering. So significant impacts are inevitable, and we will experience more extreme weather. This is happening. But on the more positive side, if we take quick, decisive action collectively, then we can help in terms of the worst and make sure that we respond well to it. So it's a big challenge, but one that we can absolutely tackle. Next slide, please. Just to give a bit of background to our working plan, and it's very similar to what you've heard from the other groups. So helpfully for us, we had an initial working group established by London councils back in 2020 that had really good representation from lots of boroughs. You can see the list there: London Climate Change Partnership, EA, GLA. They sat through a series of meetings around issues such as heat stress, water stress, flooding, pests and diseases, and natural capital. And through that process, came up with a draft action plan. So as Southwark as a lead borough took over this year, but we're in a really good position that we have a really strong, well-researched action plan that lots of people have inputted into already. So it's been really helpful. The first purpose of that action plan was, just that last point was to define what we mean by resilient and green, because it probably it could mean slightly different things to different people. The text I've highlighted in bold is our current definition, which is something we're reviewing. And that's that London should be environmentally, socially and economically resilient to climate change in a way that safeguards and enhances green and blue infrastructure and ensures they were equally accessible to all. So that's within our current action plan. Yeah, next slide, please, would be great. Just a bit more detail on what's in there. We have a policy review that talks a lot about the green recovery to COVID. There's a lot of crossover between our work stream and the others that you've heard from today. So a big part of our work is ensuring that we have synergy in our actions. So we're looking at a whole series of actions across those 5 areas that are listed: overheating, flooding, water scarcity, pests and diseases, enhanced natural capital. And that's very top level. So that could be structurally just ensuring that we're tackling these things with consistency from council to council, that we're sharing data, that we have the kind of processes in place to deal with it, right through to how we're engaging with residents on the issues, how we're planning, and how we ultimately implementing as well. So the actions are quite broad. They cover everything through that process. Our action plan has a 2-year priority work plan. So really what we need to focus on over the next 2 years. Identifies the additional powers and resources that will be needed because we can't do it alone. Really importantly, we want to review what's currently going on in London. There is some fantastic work that's going on that we want to learn from, that we want to ensure is captured within the action plan, and also identifying those really key external partners, many of whom are on the steering group already, which is great, who need to support the work of this group. Yep, next one, please. So just a quick update. So we've established our new working group. On that group, we have London councils, the GLA, London Climate Change Partnership, TfL, and a good group of boroughs. So many thanks to them who have been involved so far. So that's the City of London, Bromley, Hammersmith and Fulham, Hounslow and ourselves. As with the other groups, I think we'd welcome new members. If you have a real interest in this and you haven't been aware of it, or you haven't had time to input, I'd love to hear from you, because we do want to engage as many people as possible. We're setting up a more senior director level steering group, which will ultimately sign off the action plan, and we hope that will meet within the next month. And we're currently going through a process of reviewing our draft action plan. So looking at the definition, the overall structure, and then moving on to the 2-year work plan. As with the others, our target is to sign that action plan off by the end of this calendar year, which is doable. We're in a good position because we have a really comprehensive draft, but there's still a lot of work to do over the next couple of months. Next slide, please. So really the key thing and the sort of the seed I wanted to sow today was around collaboration. We really want to ensure that we capture best practice. So that could be from London, that could be from wider, further afield. I've put a copy in there of the Glasgow adaptation strategy, which is really comprehensive and really good. And yes, we want London examples, but if there are other UK-wide international examples we can learn from, that'd be fantastic. I think we at Southwark really want to develop an action plan that provides councils with a starting point if you're still to develop your own adaptation strategy. So for us as a borough, we published our first climate strategy this summer. We talk about adaptation, we have some actions, but one of our big actions is a subsequent strategy on adaptation. And I think that this piece of work will be a really good, will essentially set the groundwork for a more specific borough piece of work. in the future. So you may be a borough who's really advanced on this, you may be just starting off, and I think hopefully this action plan that we'll have later in the year will help you no matter where you are in the process. Really want to work collaboratively. It's clear, you know, when we're talking about flooding, overheating, these aren't issues that are restricted by borough administrative boundaries. You know, it's going to impact us all. It might be slightly different if you're a Riverside borough or an Outer London borough, but the challenges are going to be broadly the same. So collaboration and shared knowledge and working is going to be absolutely vital. So yeah, would love to hear more from people. Obviously, any questions now, but certainly over, say, this month, over the next couple of weeks, if you are working in this area doing innovative projects, I'd love to hear from you. And I think there's only just one more slide to say thank you very much. And if there's time for questions, great. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Tom, for that. You managed to turn it into a positives after quite a doom and gloom. So that was good. Very good. Any reactions, questions, discussion points for Tom on resilient and green? Just checking the chat as well. So there's nothing immediately coming. Kate, please do come in.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I have a bit of a question because I know that we've talked about the fact that many boroughs feel they're further behind with adaptation and the sort of resilient and green piece. And just, I've realised it sounds like Greenpeace, resilient and green piece. I was just wondering if we could get maybe a little bit of a show of hands for which boroughs actually have an adaptation strategy, because I know, Tom, that you've talked about maybe doing some kind of template plan and whether that would be something that could really help other boroughs. So I was just wondering if we could get a kind of a bit of a show of hands around that.
Yes, and you show your hands by reactions and either a thumbs up or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Thumbs up for those who have got an adaptation plan in place. Can we see that? I can't say that I can actually.
I can see one hand from City who I know have one.
Okay.
But if it's literally one, that's quite telling. Bromley have not. Oh, you can do a down thumb. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, so yeah. So it sounds like that is something that would be worth doing and exploring further. Thank you for that, Kate. Anything else? Oh, Julia.
Yeah, well, it's just to acknowledge that we don't have, in Richmond, we don't have a separate adaptation strategy, but some elements of our climate emergency strategy do touch on some of those issues, as do other aspects of other strategies. But just to acknowledge that we don't have one that's called that, but I think that increasingly that will be part of the explanation and engagement that we have with members of the public and other organisations, is that we're at a stage now, we've gone past it a long way, where it's only about limiting climate change. It's about how we make sure we can live and survive and thrive as best we can, given the changes that we think are really likely. And I know that includes the threat to life and to property, but it also includes a threat to our way of life in a way, our leisure activity as well as our sort of business and economic activity, and especially for boroughs that are by the river. You know, how much changing climate will impact on how we use our open spaces and how we travel to visit our friends and things like that. And it does, going back to that, it does sound a bit doom and gloom, but we do need to find positive ways. If you address some of those issues, you also improve biodiversity and ecology, you improve shading for the hot days. So if you can find the actions that improve some aspects, then there are co-benefits all over the place. And so rather than being doom and gloom, it's honesty, and then it's what should we do about it?
Yeah, I really apologise if I was doom and gloom as the seventh presenter, hopefully not. But I think you're right. I mean, the great thing that London Council's research shows is that it's mentioned in a lot of existing climate strategies, which is great. But obviously what we want to ensure is that rather than it just being sort of maybe a few actions within an existing plan, that there is, you know, that we're helping and giving people a framework for a more detailed approach. I mean, realistically, if you know, if we got to net zero next week, we're still going to have impacts from, you know, residual carbon. So we are going to have to adapt to a certain degree. I think the messaging around it, another part of our plan is the communications. And certainly if our communications around this were all doom and gloom, I think people are probably going to switch off and not change behavior as we need. So we do need to find those angles to be, yeah, positive, but, you know, and realistic at the same time, I think.
Thanks, Julia and Tom, for that. Yes, doom and gloom, probably not the best words of my using, so apologies for that. But realistic and being positive and seeing what is possible. So thank you very much to all of the presenters. That's been really, really great to hear the progress that you've all been making on those 7 programs. Something that you, oh, Victoria, you want to come in? Okay, let me come to you, Victoria. Is that about the resilient and green still? Victoria?
Hi, yes, sorry, my computer froze just at the inopportune moment there. Yeah, so just picking up on the green and resilient, has the workstream so far looked at what we can potentially do with the private sector as well to kind of look at some of this? So I'm thinking, you know, if your home's insured and you're flooded, rather than just replacing like for like, the potential to kind of build your home to be more resilient. So that kind of initial top up and putting in some of those kind of, you know, flood resistant measures and bits like that. Whereas, you know, I think there's perhaps otherwise a bit of a trick missed, but I'm not sure whether the kind of a private finance sector is thinking along those lines yet, if that's conversations we're having with them, and if there's any scope for us kind of as local authorities to perhaps bring some pressure to bear there as well.
I don't know. My honest answer is I don't think we've captured that adequately yet. So that's definitely something I think it'd be interesting for the working group to discuss. And if, yeah, if that's something that Sutton have looked at in more detail, I'd be really happy to pick that up with you as well.
I mean, it's something we've started having some initial conversations. So we've had some conversations with kind of Barclays Finance. I'm not going to say we were met with a resounding cheer of applause and yes, let's do that tomorrow. But, you know, obviously that's the start of something. And I think obviously if there's a more collective approach, I think that obviously it adds weight to that conversation. So.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's shared learning that we can have and that we can ensure we're capturing and getting into the plan, I think really welcome that. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria and Tom. Something to definitely look out for and progress, particularly around the insurance side of things. That's come to our heightened attention in the recent flooding instances, and many people just don't have enough insurance for these kind of events, and we'll need to make sure that people do have that in future and make sure that they be able to get the insurance that they need. Okay, well, thanks for that. Really great presentations, as I said, and great to hear from all of our 7 programs that have progressed massively over the last couple of years. And, you know, we've had COVID to deal with and everything else and all of the other workloads that you guys are doing and delivering in the local authorities. And you've done massive amounts on these programs on top of that. So a big thank you to all of you. It's been great to see that progress presented here today. And I've seen a couple of sort of common themes, I think, emerging. So there's a couple of things about, well, we definitely can't do it alone. We need to, work across the local authorities and across departments, but we also need to work with a lot of different partners that we are involving already, and some of them we need to involve a bit more into our programs. So, but that's been really good to see how much already is ongoing, and of course we can always do better, and we will do better, and we will involve more people along and more partners as we go along. Co-benefits has been a big theme, I would say, and we need to really talk about the co-benefits that can be achieved. So climate change is not just an environmental issues, but actually has a lot of positive outcomes for a number of other matters. So health is just one of them, but we talked about quite a few of those already. And then we've seen that there is a lot of engagement from all boroughs across London in all of these already, which is great to see. And you've now got all of the contact details from all of the different themes, or from all of the leading boroughs on the themes. So do please get in touch with them directly or through us at London Council. So Kate, Zach, or myself, and we will pass you on. So it's been lovely to see that. And we've also are currently working on a better sort of online presence for all of these programs. So trying to bring everything together, because another theme I think a lot of people have highlighted is that we need to be aware of what's going on in each other themes, so that we don't duplicate any work, but we can sort of subsidize ourselves in a way. And we need to make sure that that happens in a efficient and effective fashion. So we've got the Climate Oversight Group, of course, that comes together on a quarterly basis to talk about some of these issues. But I think we need to get a bit better in terms of how we share information across themes as well. So we're actively looking into that as London councils. So yes, I think one last thing I want to say, a big thank you to Kate Hand and Zach Bond for organizing this conference and being behind the scenes, very busy making sure that the technology works, that you all have your breakout rooms and you come back from your breakout rooms and the chat is happening, and the slides are being progressed. So thank you very much. I know a lot of work has gone into this. And now I'd just like to hand over for a couple of words from Mayor for Glanville, our London Council's Chair of the Transport and Environment Committee, for some closing words, please. Thank you very much for attending. It's been great to see you all and all of your contributions.
Thanks, Katharina, and thanks to everyone that stayed till the end. I think I was here, apart from a very brief period over lunch, and up until I think the last 5 minutes, there were over 100 attendees consistently throughout the course of the day. And given all the other responsibilities I know people are still on the call have, I think that's a testament to the level of interest around climate change, but also the incredible work that's happening, not just at a London Council's level or the work at the GLA, but absolutely the borough-led programmes which have been so vividly brought to life this afternoon. And I think we all have to be humble and say that we've learned a huge amount today. You know, none of us are experts in every field, and certainly I'm absolutely honoured that we've been able to organise this event and showcase so much of this good work. I'd like to echo Katharina's thanks to Zach and Kate. Kate and Katharina have been with me since about 7:30 this morning when we did the pre-breakfast. Some of you will have been as well, and also Deputy Mayor Rodrigues and GLA colleagues who helped shape the event and obviously were part of the opening with me. I've talked about the polling when I spoke earlier. That's now live, and obviously people can go into the detail. I also said that whenever I speak on behalf of the Transport and Environment Committee, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants, and I think everybody that has contributed to the programmatic work this afternoon just illustrates that. You know, often we canter through, we've got 7 themes, 7 programs, but actually bringing them alive today has been absolutely wonderful. I had the privilege of doing the breakout room with Islington around renewable power, and I think Francis and others there really, you know, the questions they were asking and answering were just incredible, and obviously we saw he present that in even greater detail this afternoon. The retrofit work is brilliant. We've seen not only the presentation, but the report is now live. There's an incredible amount of detail across there. And I'm not going to go through every one of the thematic pieces of work, but what was good was there is some overlap, but there's also real synergy. And I think we can be actually really positive about the fact you can see, I think it was the Hackney presentation had the sort of big flower Venn diagram of showing how these things all fit together. And I think that really came across. I do want to highlight the One World Living, because I had the privilege of being part of the launch of that work with We London and Harrow at the start of the summer. I think that's really, really important that we look at emissions across all of the things that we are responsible for. And a key part of getting to net zero is getting to deal with some of those consumption-based emissions. And it was also gratifying, I think, to see the common references back to the UK CCIC work as well, and that bridging finance that we need from private investment and how that goes into COP. I think we can be really proud, as I say. The more, better, faster, I think feels a bit daunting after an epic conference like this, but we are going to be inspired and we are going to rise to that more, better, faster kind of mission that we've set out with. I think also the communication around all of this work. Not everyone will be able to have stayed for all of the conference. I'm pleased we're going to share the slides, but I think it's also up to elected members here to make sure that colleagues back at our respective councils and our leaders understand all of this work, because I think many of the questions we often get asked are being answered, and we can speak in confidence that they are through the collaboration that we are leading. Zach is going to very kindly hopefully put up a final slide to close the event, which just outlines some of the upcoming events that numerous people have referred back to during the course of today. So we have delivered on the conference today and launched the polling on London's attitudes to climate change. We have the UK CCIC Commission launch on the 21st of October, and it should be remembered that is a London Council project with Core Cities and Connect Place Catapult, but through London Councils, everyone is a part of that work. We've got the Retrofit London formal launch next Tuesday in the morning on the 26th of October. There's the Mayor of London-led London Climate Summit on the 28th of October, and then there are numerous events at COP, some led by the UK CCIC, but I know also London Councils are part of many of the Fringe and Green Zone events. And then finally, I think I said when we talked about the polling at the start, we have matched the Londoners' Attitudes work with the work around the Business 1000 launch on the 4th of November. And I know that we are also coming back together in late November around the Task Phoenix group on urban flooding, and there are a few further tech meetings where we're going to report back on all this activity as well. And I hope that coming out of today, we can replicate some of the work that we're doing on Retrofit London and think about what are those moments early in the new year where we can come back to some of this thematic work and unpack it in greater detail and deliver those actions into next year. But thank you once again for attending. There's nothing I think that I am left to do other than say thank you again. I hope you'll come to some of these exciting events that we're organising in the next couple of weeks. Please do keep an eye on COP, even if you're not able to attend. I know a lot of boroughs are doing resident-facing work. Hackney is, I saw Islington's been tweeting about it, and there'll be many others over the next couple of weeks. And I look forward to returning to these themes later this year and early next. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And the conference is now closed. Cheers. Thank you all.